The will to live is not something everyone possesses. While some people remain stuck in their problems, a little girl in desperate need of help is fighting against a dangerous psychopath. But what can a child do against someone who has taken many lives? In December 1999, Crystal Searles was just 10 years old. She was known to be hardworking and humble. Despite her youth, she had already faced significant hardships. Unfortunately, what lay ahead for her was worse than anything she had ever experienced. Crystal and her brother were staying with friends of the Harris family in Del Rio, Texas, while waiting for their mother and younger sisters to move from Kansas. December 30th, 1999, seemed like a normal day filled with preparations for the new year. But for some, the arrival of the new millennium was about to take a tragic turn. Mark was Crystal's brother, and they both grew up in Kansas. At that time, Mark was 7 years old and Crystal was 10. They spent the day with the children of the Harris family. Crystal and Mark were welcomed by the Harris family for a while. Crystal quickly adapted by helping with household chores and forming close bonds with everyone. During the New Year holidays, Crystal looked forward to reuniting with her mother and sisters. However, she and Mark struggled to get along, likely due to their age difference and varying interests. The Harris family had several children, with Sean as the eldest, followed by Justin, Lori, and Katie. Sean had already moved out but was planning to return for the holidays. That night, the Harris family planned to go into town to pick up Sean and the two older kids. The result is that Crystal, Katie, and Mark would be left alone at home without any adults around. The house was situated in a remote area, surrounded by nature, with few neighbors nearby. That night, little Mark was scared of the dark, wanted to sleep in the same room as the older girls, Crystal and Katie. However, they pushed him away because they wanted to share a secret. Upset, Mark had to go to the next room. It took him 2 hours to calm down and fall asleep. The next morning, sunlight poured into the room, waking Mark up. The curtains had been pulled back. When he opened his eyes, a strange woman was there. She handed him some clothes, urged him to get ready to leave. When Mark stepped out, he was shocked to find a large pool of blood on the floor, with stains and splatters on the walls and door. The floor was almost completely covered in it. People around him were crying and panicking, but Mark couldn't understand what was going on. He looked for his sister but couldn't find her or Katie. The adults ignored his questions about the girls. When detectives arrived at the house, they were immediately struck by the amount of blood present. In the room where the girls had spent the night, they found 13-year-old Katie lying on the floor, unresponsive. It was clear from her severe injuries that she had fought for her life but had ultimately succumbed to a fatal cut to her throat, resulting in blood loss. In contrast, Crystal was fortunate to have survived the attack by an unknown assailant, although she was in critical condition. At around 6 a.m. on December 31st, 1999, Pam Searles, Crystal's mother, received a call. They asked for her permission to perform an emergency operation because her daughter was in critical condition with a severe throat injury. Pam was in shock and struggled to understand what had happened. Crystal quickly became an important witness for the police, even as she battled for her life in a local hospital's operating room. After a successful surgery, she was placed on life support, including a ventilator, as she was unable to breathe independently. When her mother arrived at the hospital, Crystal's condition had improved. The surgeon had managed to save her life, but her trachea and vocal cords had sustained serious injuries. Despite her state, Crystal's main concern was whether her friend Katie had survived. However, Pam did not have the strength to tell her that her friend had died. As soon as Crystal woke up after the surgery, she wanted to speak to the police to tell them what had happened. According to Crystal, she and her friend had gone to bed quite late. She had no idea what time it was when she was awakened by a scream. Raising her head from the top bunk, she saw a man with disheveled hair, a thick beard, and dark, angry eyes standing in front of her. She immediately noticed that Katie was bleeding and that this stranger had a knife in his hand. He covered Katie's mouth with his hand, slowly cutting her throat. The attacker hadn't noticed Crystal at first and was about to leave, but when Katie fell to the floor and began to make death rattles, Crystal recoiled involuntarily when their eyes met. Turning around one last time, the criminal spotted Crystal on the top bunk. Terrified, she tried to climb down to escape through the open window. With a quick movement, he caught up with her and cut her throat as well. Then the stranger disappeared from the house. Despite her injury, Crystal was able to crawl. She climbed down from the top bunk with difficulty and headed for the bedroom door. On the way, she bumped into her friend, who was still making horse sounds, and then went quiet. Crystal lay down next to Katie, hugged her, and wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, but she couldn't. In that moment, she realized that she was mute. The criminal had severed her vocal cords. She was unable to utter a single word clearly. Suddenly, Crystal realized that she needed to ask for help. The phone was useless in her case, so she wrote a note asking for help and decided to get to the neighbors. With her throat cut, Crystal crawled out onto the terrace of the house, dressed in her pajamas and without shoes, but she saw a light in the distance, realized that it was her goal. Crystal stood up with difficulty and walked slowly toward the light. When she reached the neighboring house, which was a good distance away, she began to pound on the door. Then she heard a man's voice asking who was there. Unable to speak, she continued to knock as hard as she could until he opened the door. The neighbor saw the bloody girl, read the note, and called the police. Crystal's brother was unharmed because he had been in another room where the attacker had not entered. Based on the words of Crystal, a composite sketch was created. A check of the police database revealed several potential suspects with various convictions. The next day, the police returned to Crystal and presented several photographs for identification. Crystal confidently pointed to the image of Tommy Lynn Sells, who immediately became the prime suspect. At that time, he was in Del Rio, having arrived relatively recently. Up until that point, he had committed only minor offenses, but Crystal recognized that empty, cruel look instantly. The detectives decided to investigate him. When Tommy's door was knocked on early in the morning, he was informed that he was under arrest for murder. He came out to meet the police and immediately stated that he was glad he was finally caught because he was tired of committing these acts. Initially, the police did not grasp the alarming significance of Tommy's words. He told them about the murder weapon, which turned out to be a 30-centimeter butcher knife. He had used it often over the years, and the blade had been sharpened regularly. It had simply broken. The man had thrown the knife in the bushes near his home, where it was found with traces of blood. Tommy was taken to the county sheriff's office. From the beginning, he willingly cooperated with the authorities, confessed without hesitation to the murder of Katie and the attempted murder of Crystal. He was surprised when he learned about the surviving girl. Tommy agreed to reconstruct the events in the house where he had killed Katie. His behavior seemed odd considering the terrible crimes being discussed. At the same time, he was clearly sealing his own fate by cooperating with the authorities. Tommy began to recount the details of the night of the crime. He explained that as soon as he approached the house, he noticed the open window, which made it easier for him to enter. He walked down the hallway, saw different children sleeping in various rooms, and then chose one with a bunk bed. He entered quietly, approached the lower bunk. Tommy began stabbing and cut Katie's throat. Before leaving, he noticed the second girl and also cut her throat. The detectives managed to find out he had been friends with the Harris family for a long time. It was suspected that, based on this relationship, he had planned the attack on Katie in advance, likely intending to abuse her. Tommy did indeed abuse Katie first, then killed her because he was thirsty for blood. Before arriving at the Harris house, he had intended to break into a trailer where 6 people lived. He knew them and wanted to kill them all, but he feared they might fight back, so he changed his mind at the last moment, sought easier prey. He had heard that the Harris family was hosting a couple of children and that they might be alone that night. Crystal's mother felt guilty for not being there for her daughter during such a terrible time in her life, but she had been forced to settle various issues before moving. To better understand what had happened, she expressed a desire to visit the crime scene. Upon arriving, she witnessed a scene that resembled a horror movie, with an entire floor covered in blood. Crystal had run for help with her last strength, leaving bloody handprints on the wall. Immediately after his arrest, Tommy behaved quite calmly. He was being transported to prison when he shocked the law enforcement officers by suggesting that they probably wanted to know about all the other murders he had committed. This surprised all the police officers, especially since they hadn't even asked him about other possible crimes before. Detectives usually avoid allowing journalists to be present during interrogations, as this could lead to important information being widely publicized and having unpredictable consequences. However, this time, the situation was serious. There were numerous murders involved. Ultimately, the decision was made to allow the media to participate in the interviews, which would quickly spread Tommy's story across the country, potentially help find people who had also survived his attacks and could identify their assailant. A reliable journalist, trusted by the police, was chosen for this purpose and was able to convey Tommy's story clearly, without distortion. The journalist sat in the interrogation room for hours, listening to Tommy recount stories of his life, describing his journeys from state to state while killing men, women, and children without remorse. He was a cold-blooded madman, recounting real bloody scenes as if they were made-up campfire horror stories. Among the most vivid childhood memories that Tommy shared was his father's phrase, "Dead men don't talk." From the start, he doubted that any of his victims could have survived the attack. In his opinion, Crystal was very lucky, but it was unlikely that anyone else had been so fortunate. Even at this stage, the extent of his madness was unclear. Over the next 9 months, he communicated regularly with detectives in the presence of a journalist. In total, he described 22 murders that he committed with his own hands. There were other unconfirmed incidents that could not be verified. Clearly, many more crimes had been committed. This man's words were corroborated by his knife, which he had used all these years to take the lives of innocents. The blade had been sharpened so many times that it became very thin and resembled a slate. The butcher knife didn't even look like a kitchen tool, it resembled something from a torture chamber. After all these events, surgeries, discharge, talking to detectives and journalists, Crystal was gradually recovering. She was shocked by the extent of her injuries. A long scar remained on her throat after the surgery, and she cried when she saw it for the first time. Her mother took her to Kansas, away from the scene of the massacre, but they still had to return to Texas for her to testify against the serial killer. 9 months had passed since the murder and attempted murder. Tommy's stories about other crimes had ended. Crystal was 11 years old by this point. She managed to partially recover, but only physically. Psychologically, she continued to struggle with the consequences of the horrors she had witnessed, as well as the cruelty of the madman she now had to testify against in court. She was the main witness for the prosecution. From the very beginning, the situation was tense. Crystal had not seen the criminal since the night he slit her friend's throat before her eyes, almost killing her. It was hard for everyone caught up in Tommy's villainy. During the hearings in Texas, Crystal was taken in by Texas Ranger Johnny Allen, who was a family man with 2 children at the time. Crystal met their daughters, hoping that this would help distract her from her situation. According to the family, Crystal would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, thrashing around in bed as if trying to escape from someone. Everyone knew this was what her nightmares were about, but the girl was determined not to give up. Tommy's lawyer also had a difficult task ahead of him. He knew all too well that his client was a dangerous serial criminal who had taken dozens of lives for no reason. His only strategy was to try to avoid capital punishment. He was not going to deny the charges. Despite the adults' concerns, Crystal even spoke enthusiastically about the upcoming meeting with Tommy. She understood that now he would not have a chance to attack her, so she was not afraid. She simply wanted to achieve a fair punishment for this monster. Crystal comforted herself with the thought that she was the reason he was caught and that she had stopped the chain of murders at his hands. According to the prosecutor's office, if Crystal had not miraculously survived that attack and pointed out Tommy, he would have continued his bloody spree across the United States. Who knows how many more people could have died from his knife? The courageous schoolgirl thought that by doing this, she was pursuing justice and vengeance for her friend who had been killed. Up until the day of her testimony, Crystal felt very inspired. That morning, she woke up to find her mother so worried that she was in tears. She asked her mother to calm down so that she wouldn't be distracted from this important moment that could help them stop the serial killer. During the hearings, Crystal once again demonstrated her fortitude. She walked to the stand when called to testify, passing mere centimeters away from the criminal. Although she could have chosen to enter through a specially prepared secret door for such cases, she expressed a desire to walk past the assailant who had cut her throat. She stated that she was not afraid of the man. At one point, however, her determination wavered slightly. While Crystal was on the stand, Tommy displayed no panic, nervousness, or tears. He didn't even look at her while she spoke and answered questions. Crystal confirmed that it was this man who had slit her and her friends' throats, pointing at him. Conversely, he appeared to be impatiently waiting for a decision, which made Crystal increasingly nervous. Eventually, the tension overwhelmed her. She burst into tears and could no longer speak. The court took a forced 15-minute break to allow the prosecution's main witness to compose herself. After the break, Crystal returned to her previous resolve, showing the jury her scar across her throat, a mark that the defendant had left on her body for the rest of her life. Then there was a demonstration of the attack. Crystal lay on a makeshift table that was meant to represent a bed, showing how the attacker had stabbed her with a knife. This allowed the jury to comprehend the scale of the cruelty and horror that the child had endured. The girl illustrated how she had tried to cover her throat with her hands, having witnessed what Tommy had done to her friend, not wanting to share the same fate. Perhaps this instinct is what saved her from a fatal hemorrhage that could have killed her within minutes. The courage of the 11-year-old schoolgirl was acknowledged by her lawyer. Instead of cross-examining her, the defense attorney praised her and did not ask a single question. At that moment, it became clear that even a serial killer's defense attorney was on the side of the victims. No one expected the trial to be so short, especially in such a high-profile case. However, the jury returned with a verdict after about an hour of deliberation. They found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. Now only one question remained: would he receive life in prison or the death penalty? The final stage of the trial was set. No one suspected that the brave little girl sitting in front of everyone actually harbored other secrets. Mark Searles, Crystal's father, believed he understood why his daughter had such a strong, determined character, which enabled her to confront this monster. He was convinced that she simply knew what to do. According to Mark, he and Pam began using illegal substances 5 years before these tragic events. He claimed that the addiction quickly took over subjecting them to a tumultuous cycle of attempting to recover and then falling back into addiction. They began to quarrel more frequently, and things spiraled out of control. Mark got into serious legal trouble, which only worsened over time. Meanwhile, Pam desperately sought to restore her normal life, distance herself from anything related to illegal activities. Ultimately, she filed for divorce, focused on overcoming her addiction. Pam got herself together and concentrated on her children. However, years earlier, Crystal had assumed the role of caretaker, as she was the eldest girl in the family. She recalled a time when her parents were dependent, how her father could sleep all day without regaining consciousness. As a result, she was forced to care for her younger siblings. Naturally, she also attended school. Despite her young age, the schoolgirl began to grasp the harsh realities of life. She became a reliable support for her mother, changed her sister's diapers, fed them, put them to bed, prepared for school in the mornings, and even cooked her own meals. By her own admission, Crystal felt like the unluckiest girl in her class, as others did not face such struggles. Crystal was never driven to or picked up from school, nor did she receive help. Of course, this situation seemed unjust. On the other hand, would she have been able to ask for help if not for the independence forced upon her in her early years? According to her sisters, during that time, Crystal took on the responsibilities of both her mother and father, with many not even knowing what her parents looked like because she shouldered almost all of the family responsibilities. Crystal remembered the moment her mother, Pam, decided to end it all. Pam managed to quit and gradually return to a normal life. However, from her recollections, her father remained entrenched in criminal circles. He could not quit, and many believed he didn't even try. By Mark's own admission, he couldn't stop using and selling banned substance, finding himself drawn into criminal schemes, fearing that leaving that lifestyle would be a dangerous decision. After Pam and the children moved out, Mark was arrested a few months later. Pam felt relieved to have left him, as staying with him might have jeopardized her dreams of a new life. He ended up in jail because of his criminal connections. His daughters was so angry with him that she simply stopped answering his calls, blaming him for choosing illegal substances over family. Mark he learned about the attack on his daughter. At that moment, he was behind bars and could not help her in any way. At the time of the attack, Mark was serving a sentence for the sale and possession of illegal substances. He was in prison for about 3 months. Suddenly, at 10 a.m., an unexpected visit occurred, as it was outside the permitted visiting hours. The matter was urgent. His mother and sister came to inform him about what had happened to Crystal. Emotions ran high. If he had not been incarcerated, he would have torn Tommy apart with his own hands. Naturally, this didn't change much. Mark couldn't change anything, not even be present in court to support his daughter. But at that moment, something shifted in him. He rethought his life, which had brought his daughter to that house on that fateful night. If it weren't for his problems, no one would have attacked Crystal. Meanwhile, there was one main issue to be resolved: determining what punishment the serial killer would receive for the murder of Katie and the attempted murder of Crystal. Pam had wanted the death penalty for the attacker from the very beginning. Crystal initially supported this decision, but gradually she concluded that she did not want to become like that creature who thirsted for blood. She advocated for a life sentence instead. However, compared to crimes, the prosecutor's office demanded the death penalty. The jury supported this initiative. In the end, Tommy was sentenced to death. The court believed that this would allow him to atone not only for Katie and Crystal but for all of his other victims. He eluded authorities for 20 years and was finally stopped thanks to a brave schoolgirl. Tommy Lynn Sells was born in Oakland, California, on June 28, 1964, one of 5 children of a single mother. He hardly knew his father. Tommy's sister fell ill and died when she was only 1.5 years old. After that, he was sent to live with his aunt, where he behaved poorly. He was returned to his mother, who did not want him. By the age of 7, Tommy had begun to drink alcohol and soon became the victim of abuse by an adult man. From the age of 10, he became addicted to banned substance and troubled his grandmother. All family members began to fear him, eventually kicked him out of the house. From the age of 14, Tommy began to wander. When he was 17, he found his mother and began to molest her in the shower. He was placed in a psychiatric clinic, where he was diagnosed with several disorders, including bipolar disorder. However, the treatment did not help. His condition worsened due to alcohol and substance abuse. According to Tommy, he committed his first murder at 15, on July 5, 1979, in Port Gibson, Mississippi, when he shot and killed 39-year-old John Kay during a home invasion. Witnesses described a suspect who resembled Tommy. The violence escalated from there. The next attack occurred on April 27, 1982, in St. Louis, Missouri, when 35-year-old Joanne Tate, 35, was abused and murdered in her home. Notably, another man had already been convicted and was serving time for this crime, but he was later exonerated. Tommy committed several murders of single mothers with children, breaking into their homes at night, kidnapping the children from their homes, abusing, and killing them in various ways. The style of each crime was different, so detectives did not see a connection between the attacks. The criminal did not spare anyone, even small children. Sometimes he would meet a future victim, gain her trust, enter her house, then kill her and her children. Tommy's most horrific murder was the attack on the Dardine family, where he killed 4 people at once. On November 17, 1987, while hitchhiking, he was picked up by 29-year-old Keith Dardine, who kindly brought him home for dinner. But instead of gratitude, Tommy shot Keith and then beat his 3-year-old son to death. He then proceeded to assault the pregnant wife of the homeowner, who gave birth to a baby girl during the attack. He killed both the wife and the newborn. Tommy's last known crime was the attack on Kathy and Crystal. For some of the 22 established murders, he received life sentences in various states. For others, he was never convicted, believing that the death penalty would suffice. Despite the fact that Crystal had defeated a serial killer, she had mixed feelings. She did not feel joy at the upcoming execution of Tommy, as she had never been the kind of person who indulged in such things, no matter who the perpetrator was. However, she did not challenge the verdict. Now, Crystal faced a much harder and longer struggle. Her parents were confident that she would cope with the consequences of the attack. Her mother and sisters rallied around her, even sleeping together in the same bed to provide support. Unfortunately, this did not always allow Crystal to rest fully. At times, she could spend an entire night without blinking, staring at the closed window of her room. By her own admission, during such moments, she thought about her escape routes in case of an attack. If the criminal entered through that window, she knew to run out through the other one. And if he entered through the door, she also knew how to hide quickly. In addition, it was important for Crystal to know that her loved ones were nearby. The girl felt reassured simply by the fact that her mother and sisters were alive and breathing. She could sense it. Gradually, Crystal began to regain her sense of self. Her father, Mark, spent 3 years behind bars. When he was released, he immediately sought to improve his relationship with his daughter, who had miraculously survived the attack of a serial killer. He understood that she needed support and help. She saw her father on the right path, even attending her graduation. However, Crystal felt that the relationship with her father was still a struggle. Their relationship continued to improve gradually, and both looked at it positively. Crystal was in a mentally difficult situation. It was not easy for her to feel joy despite an unconditional victory while her friend had died. Gradually, she returned to her usual life and became like a mother to the younger members of the family. Later, she spoke repeatedly with journalists, sharing that she cannot psychologically develop trust in people. Because of this, she has difficulties with relationships, although she genuinely wants to build a family. Nevertheless, Crystal still believes in the best. She even saw her father cope, quit crime and addiction, gradually make up for lost time. She is now 35 years old. Crystal is close to her family and constantly remembers her friend who was killed before her eyes. The events of that terrible night remain etched in her memory. Little is known about her personal life at the moment. On January 3, 2014, a judge set Tommy's execution date. The death sentence by lethal injection was carried out on April 3, 2014, at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. Crystal and members of the Harris family were present at the execution. Hello, crime enthusiasts. Are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Jamie Stice. On April 12, 2011, in the small town of Morgantown, Kentucky, with a population of 2,500, 30-year-old Kathy Coy unexpectedly went into labor while driving. She had to give birth in her car on the side of the road, close to her home. Kathy had little time to call her friend, Shelley Lindsay, to inform her that she was about to give birth and needed help. When Shelley arrived, she was in the back seat of the car, covered in blood and holding her newborn. Sadly, the joy of becoming a mother was short-lived. Kathy noticed that the baby was having trouble breathing, so Shelley quickly called emergency services and drove them to the medical center. Kathy's hopes of motherhood were overshadowed by a grim situation. The doctors were very concerned. The baby's condition was critical. He was taken urgently to the intensive care unit due to breathing difficulties and a low body temperature, known as cold shock, which can be life-threatening. The doctors were not only worried about the newborn but also had concerns for Kathy and her family's emotional state during this crisis. The police arrived to investigate the situation. They went to the home where Kathy's children from a previous marriage lived with their grandmother. Officers spoke with the eldest daughter, 11-year-old Brianna, and her grandmother. The children expressed surprise at their mother's new baby, as they did not believe she was pregnant. They mentioned that she intended to meet with a friend who was also pregnant, but no one knew the friend's name. The situation seemed suspicious. Detectives accessed Kathy's social media account and identified a friend of hers, 21-year-old Jamie Stice, who was pregnant. The police attempted to reach Jamie but were unable to make contact. The detectives subsequently reached out to Jamie's mother, Jeannie. She informed them that her daughter was in the final stages of pregnancy and that she hadn't heard from Jamie since 9:30 that morning. Concerned, she was contemplating reporting her daughter as missing but realized that the police might not act quickly since not enough time had passed. While the investigation was ongoing, detectives spoke with Kathy again to clarify the timeline of the incident from that day. Kathy confirmed that she had given birth. She explained that she had woken up early, saw her husband Shannon off to work around 4:30 a.m., and then left to meet her friend Jamie around 10 a.m. After their meeting, as she was returning home, she began to feel contractions. Kathy stopped at a restaurant to grab a quick bite but felt the need to leave in a hurry. Realizing she wouldn't reach the hospital in time, she called her closest friend for assistance. Shelley, Kathy's friend, recounted that when she received the call for help, she rushed outside and saw Kathy in the back seat of a car. Kathy was not wearing pants, only a bloody shirt, and she held a baby in her arms, who was also covered in blood, as if he had just been born. Shelley noticed the placenta and recognized that her friend needed urgent help, especially since the baby was struggling to breathe. She quickly got into her car and drove to the medical center. Shelley observed that the baby was covered in grass and dirt but assumed he had fallen and gotten dirty in the car. There was no time to learn more, her priority was supporting the newborn. Both women's accounts were largely similar, with one key difference. Kathy claimed that Shelley delivered the baby, while Shelley denied this. The situation was chaotic, with Kathy in labor crying out, and both her and the baby's conditions creating confusion. While doctors worked to assist the baby, Kathy pleaded with them to save his life. There were concerns about whether the situation was staged, leading to the decision to take Kathy in for questioning at the station. At that time, Kathy had already been examined by doctors, and her condition seemed stable. However, when the police began questioning her about her friend Jamie on social media, her story started to change. Initially, she claimed that she had only briefly met Jamie before ending their friendship. Kathy explained that she had driven Jamie to the Social Security office, dropped her off near the building, and then Jamie had left in an unknown direction. At that point, Kathy began to experience contractions, which forced her to leave abruptly. This part of her story raised doubts. To support her new version, Kathy presented a message from Jamie, which allegedly asked her to pick Jamie up from the Social Security office, a request Kathy refused due to complications in their story. However, when detectives expressed their disbelief, Kathy's narrative shifted again. Now, Kathy stated that she had picked up Jamie and taken her home, but Jamie was so exhausted that she collapsed on the sofa. Kathy claimed her contractions only started after this encounter. The significant changes in her story seemed implausible, but she attributed them to the stress of the emergency situation. Detectives aimed to determine the truth about how Kathy and Jamie met. Jamie's mother, Jeannie, stated that they had known each other for only a couple of months after connecting through social media. Jamie is pregnant with a baby. When asked about Kathy's relationship with Jamie, Kathy claimed she had known Jamie for only a few weeks and had been introduced through a mutual friend while seeking help with housing issues. At this point, inconsistencies regarding their acquaintance and its purpose emerged. Kathy couldn't even name this mutual friend, even though Jamie was 20 weeks pregnant, aligning with her due date, which raised further suspicion. Kathy was later informed that something significant might have occurred around 10:30 a.m., right after their meeting. Jamie was missing, and detectives informed the parents that they could not reach out to her. They encouraged Kathy to assist in the search. At this point, they were already skeptical about whether the baby truly belonged to Kathy. Kathy's husband, Shannon, arrived at the station. He was thrilled that his wife had finally given birth but was confused about why she was being held and questioned. Shannon informed the police that Kathy had experienced miscarriages in the past, which had led her to struggle with depression. Despite the challenges, she remained hopeful about becoming pregnant again and starting a family. He feared that if their efforts failed, their relationship might end. For a woman desperate to become a mother, the thought of losing her husband could push her to desperate actions, even to the point of harming another woman. It was possible that Kathy had pretended to be pregnant to keep her husband with her. Additionally, her friend Shelley, who took her to the hospital during labor, might have played a role in this situation. Kathy frequently visited Shelley and shared stories about her pregnancy, but it was unclear whether Shelley supported Kathy's deception, suspected her, or had unwittingly assisted in a crime. Shelley told the detectives that she had never faced such accusations before. However, during the investigation, it became clear that she was involved in several aspects of the deception. For instance, after Kathy returned from a gynecologist appointment where she learned she was not pregnant, Shelley pretended to be a nurse. Kathy feared that this news could push her husband to leave her, so she asked Shelley to call him, posing as a nurse who confirmed her pregnancy. Shelley claimed she had no idea that Kathy was pretending to be pregnant or plotting anything deceitful. She believed everything was genuine and was genuinely happy for her friend. Kathy managed to convince Shelley, using various excuses, that pregnancy came with complications and that Shelley's support could help save her marriage. Up until the end, Shelley truly believed that Kathy would soon give birth. However, not everyone shares the same perspective as Shelley. When the police spoke to Kathy's other friends and her husband's relatives, it became clear that there had been a lot of discussion about Kathy's situation over the past 6 months. Many people suspected that she had been deceitful. For example, her mother-in-law often tried to reach out to her, hoping to find out the truth. She believes that Kathy is merely trying to deceive everyone, especially Shannon, to bind him to herself. The mother-in-law was very frustrated with Kathy's behavior and discussed it with her son, Shannon. For a short time, he listened to her concerns. A lot of suspicion arose from the continuous delays in the expected due date. The situation dragged on for so long that it started to seem unrealistic, as Kathy herself had no clear idea of when she would give birth. Witnesses noted that over the past few months, her belly has sometimes appeared smaller and then larger. By late 2011, the mother-in-law was convinced that Kathy was lying and was simply afraid of losing Shannon. She managed to persuade her son by highlighting that his wife was clearly deceiving him. He began to demand proof of the pregnancy, which led to even more elaborate deceptions. To maintain the ruse, Kathy stole an ultrasound photo during a visit. This image helped convince her husband, but it was not the only tactic she used. After stealing the ultrasound photo, Shannon is overjoyed about his wife's pregnancy. However, if the truth were revealed, their relationship would be over. His mother insisted that her son had been deceived. In the face of growing doubts, Shannon demanded more proof. His wife was well prepared and even managed to show him a video of their baby's heartbeat, which she had downloaded from the internet. Shannon was repeatedly misled. His mother was disappointed but unaware of the depths of the deception. She simply didn't know Kathy well enough. As the due date approached, Kathy needed more than just a friend acting as a nurse, a video, and a stolen ultrasound photo. After Jamie's disappearance, the photo was used to convince the police and medical staff that Kathy had given birth to the boy. As they contemplated the situation, a troubling image formed in their minds of how Kathy could have acquired the baby and why his mother, Jamie, was missing. Meanwhile, Kathy was already in an interrogation room at the local police station. Despite being stubborn and refusing to admit anything, she continued to provide confused and conflicting testimony, changing her story with each new detail the police revealed. There was no longer any doubt about her dishonesty, but they needed a confession. It was time to employ some tactics. They decided to leave her in the interrogation room alone for a while. This clever move aimed to see how she would respond and what attempts she would make to extricate herself from the situation. The plan worked, but not in the way they had anticipated. Kathy suddenly grabbed her mobile phone and called an unfamiliar number, pretending to talk to Jamie. When the detectives returned, she mentioned it, but she still couldn't provide any information about Jamie. A check on the phone number revealed that she hadn't actually called Jamie at all. The detectives quickly confirmed that there was no doubt that the boy Kathy had brought to the hospital was Jamie's child. DNA testing confirmed this connection. Although the detectives continued to act confidently, Kathy began to waver in her story. Unfortunately, she still refused to acknowledge what had happened to Jamie. The police informed Kathy that witnesses had seen Jamie get into her car alone that morning, and no one saw her come back, contradicting Kathy's claims. They tried to determine where Kathy had taken Jamie. Why was she holding the baby? Doctors noted that the baby's breathing issues and hypothermia were not accidental. He had been born less than an hour before arriving at the medical center, and his airways were still filled with fluid. Kathy seemed overwhelmed and unsure of how to help him, which caused the baby's condition to worsen. Once these facts were revealed, Kathy presented a new version of her story. Kathy revealed that about 9 months before the current incident, she had visited the hospital and learned from the doctor that she had suffered another miscarriage. After leaving the clinic, she encountered a woman named Ashley, who suggested that she could buy a child for $550 that was expected to be born to Jamie, but insisted they would need to wait until the boy was born. Kathy agreed right away and paid, hoping this would help save her marriage. Afterward, she pretended to be pregnant to maintain the deception while waiting for the birth. On the day of the incident, Kathy claimed she took the child from Jamie and left, asserting that she did not harm him. Kathy's account sounded unbelievable. How could Ashley plan such a transaction, and how did she know 9 months in advance that Jamie would have a baby, especially a boy? Furthermore, Kathy could not provide any contact information or even a description of Ashley, making it clear that she was lying. The detectives quickly noticed her inconsistencies. Eventually, she admitted that the story about purchasing a baby was untrue, but she continued to claim that she took the baby from Jamie's home early in the morning, insisting that Jamie simply vanished after handing over the baby. Kathy did not explain how she ended up with a stranger's child in her arms, although it was evident that the child was Jamie's son. Investigators were quickly able to uncover Kathy's identity and found unsettling details about her. Her stepfather, Imran, reported witnessing her shocking behavior on several occasions. He described her as cruel, manipulative, and unpredictable, believing she was capable of committing terrible acts for her own enjoyment and benefit. Imran mentioned that Kathy had once confessed to him her potential to commit murder. Therefore, he was not surprised to see her in police custody, convinced that she could commit any crime and was indifferent to the pain she caused others. It became clear that Kathy was already known to law enforcement. Detectives found a police report accusing her of stalking a pregnant teacher with whom she worked. Their interactions at school were frequent, and Kathy's behavior had become so troubling that it frightened the teacher, who detailed several disturbing incidents. One particularly alarming moment occurred when the teacher was alone in her office and noticed Kathy silently watching her from the aisle. Remarkably, during the time the teacher was pregnant, Kathy also claimed that she was expecting a baby. Later, the teacher experienced a miscarriage, and shortly after that, Kathy's alleged pregnancy also ended. If these events had unfolded differently, that teacher might have become a victim instead of Jamie. The detectives were determined to extract a confession from Kathy. They were not going to let her leave but needed solid evidence first. There were crucial details that Kathy was not aware of. Despite her persistence, the investigators believed that Jamie was no longer alive. When Kathy and her friend Shelley arrived at the hospital with the child, the placenta was discovered. This raised serious concerns about the childbirth. Normally, placentas remain inside the mother after delivery, leading to suspicions that Kathy had attempted an untrained surgical procedure, similar to a cesarean section. The police interviewed doctors and hospital staff. Experts indicated that if a mother's heart stops, there is typically a window of no more than 5 minutes to save the baby. Kathy was likely aware of this urgency, which may have caused her to act carelessly and make several mistakes that could have endangered her child's life. Detectives believed that Jamie had bled out and died shortly after the brutal procedure began. During the questioning, Kathy began to show signs of distress but did not admit to murder. She continued to weave stories under the detectives' pressure, avoiding direct questions, and suggested that she needed to be placed in a psychiatric unit, implying she was mentally unstable. In response, the police shifted their approach. Instead of pressuring her further, they tried to soothe her, suggesting that her actions might have been accidental. Their goal was to gather any information they could. Kathy was the last person to see Jamie alive, so all suspicion fell on her. The police continued their investigation due to concerns that she might evade capture. The police questioned those closest to Kathy, but no one could confirm her story. However, detectives eventually gathered important information revealing Kathy's true nature. Her own children shared troubling insights about her. Just 2 weeks before Kathy showed up at the hospital with a baby, she had visited a flea market with her kids and purchased a powerful stun gun. The seller warned that this model could incapacitate an adult with direct contact. While testing it, Kathy approached a large stranger at the market and waved the stun gun in front of him. When he remained unfazed, she pressed it against his leg, causing him to collapse. Pleased with her actions, Kathy laughed and walked away. Under pressure from detectives, Kathy began to disclose unsettling details of her plan. She initially wanted to simulate giving birth as realistically as possible, even considering placing the fetus and placenta inside herself. When this proved too complicated, she devised an alternative. Arriving at a friend's house, she sat in the back seat, holding the baby while using cut-out female organs to create the illusion of having just given birth. Regardless, she still refused to reveal Jamie's whereabouts. Her family members confirmed her violent tendencies. In fact, Kathy's own mother was so afraid of her that she took Kathy's children from her first marriage and raised them herself. Shannon's relatives were horrified by Kathy's erratic behavior and urged him to end their relationship. After receiving partial recognition of her situation, Kathy began to elaborate on her belief that she had multiple personalities. She insisted that it was not her, but an alter ego named Lindsay, who approached her friend with the baby. This persona was used to shift the blame for everything that happened to Jamie, although Kathy avoided providing specific details. She frequently mentioned that she belonged in a mental hospital instead of prison. Kathy claimed that when her personality switched, she experienced blackouts and couldn't remember anything. She described instances where she could get into a car, lose touch with reality, and wake up in a completely different part of the city without knowing how she got there. Detectives, however, suspected that Kathy was lying. They discovered that she had previously discussed plans to kidnap another child with her relatives and had even sought her children's assistance. When they refused, she dismissed it as a joke. Kathy's mother recounted how her daughter had repeatedly urged her to help commit murder, but she flatly refused. People who knew Kathy well denied her claims of having a split personality, stating that she had never exhibited such issues before. During the interrogation, Kathy's second personality appeared very self-assured, insisting that no charges could stick to her. Kathy continued to assert that Jamie was alive, despite the severity of Jamie's injuries, which made survival impossible. This bravado quickly faded when Kathy learned she was being accused of murder. After her arrest, Kathy finally agreed to cooperate with the authorities, even leading them to the location of Jamie's body. It was then that the true extent of the crime emerged. Kathy's friendship with Jamie was greatly exaggerated. In reality, Jamie had been another victim of Kathy, who had been stalking her. Kathy had lured Jamie into meetings with gifts and promises of a job. She brought the police to a wooded area where Jamie's body was found, badly mutilated and lifeless, with signs of being shocked by a stun gun on her neck. This was the same stun gun that Kathy had purchased at a flea market with her children just 2 weeks prior to the crime. When Jamie's body was discovered, it was revealed that she had died from multiple stab wounds and excessive blood loss. Kathy had immobilized her with an electric shock gun and then performed a cesarean section in the forest. This is why the baby was found covered in grass and dirt when Kathy brought him to her friend's house. Kathy admitted that she hadn't researched adequately to prepare for such a dangerous procedure. She only looked online once and thought that was sufficient, which was clearly inadequate for someone without any medical training. Kathy, who was 40 years old, was charged with first-degree murder, as well as kidnapping both an adult and a baby. In court, she cried and pleaded guilty to the charges of kidnapping and murder. The baby she had taken from Jamie survived and was later named Isaiah Allen Stice Reynolds, honoring his late mother with his second surname. He was placed with his father. Kathy sent letters to her children explaining what had happened, but those letters contained many lies. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her children were placed in a foster home, and her husband remarried, finding a stable partner. In interviews, Kathy's children stated that on the day of the crime, Their mother appeared completely normal and was not anxious about the act she was committing. During the trial, Kathy's stepfather expressed his sorrow, not primarily for his relationship with Kathy, but because he was relieved that she could no longer harm anyone. He also felt deep remorse over Jamie's death, regretting that he hadn't reported Kathy to the police after she confessed her intention to kill, believing that doing so might have saved Jamie's life. The case of Jamie Stice is a chilling story of despair, deceit, and unspeakable acts of brutality. Set in the peaceful small town of Morgantown, Kentucky, this tragedy reveals the dark side of the desire to become a mother, leading Kathy Coy down an unforgivable path of crime. Jamie Stice, a young pregnant woman filled with hopes for the future, became a victim of manipulation and horrifying violence, leaving her son, Isaiah Allen Stice Reynolds, motherless from the moment he was born. Kathy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and must pay for her sins. However, the pain she inflicted on Jamie's family and her own is irreparable. This case serves not only as a warning about the destructive power of deceit but also raises questions about the boundary between love and obsession. Crime lovers, what do you think about this haunting ending? Leave your thoughts. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Mary Stauffer. Mary was born in West Duluth, Minnesota, USA, and her family moved to the neighboring town of Hummontown when she was 10 years old. She had 3 siblings, all of whom graduated from a local school and planned to go to college. Mary attended college and graduated in 1965. She loved working with children and dreamed of teaching, a dream that came true when she got a job at a school. She is a math teacher. In her personal life, everything was also successful. She married a seminary graduate, Irv Stauffer. They were devout Baptists. They first went to the Philippines as missionaries in 1967, and the trip was successful. Mary taught in Minneapolis for a couple of years. Then they moved to Polk, Nebraska, where her husband was asked to become the pastor of a congregation. They dedicated themselves to serving the church there, where both of their children were born. In 1975, they returned to the Philippines to undertake a 4-year mission trip. There, they planted new churches on the islands and returned home to Minnesota in 1979. Mary was planning to go to the Philippines again, this time intending to take her children with her. A few days before the family was to leave for the Philippines, while they were in the suburbs of St. Paul, they were destined to meet a person who would turn their lives upside down. On May 16, 1980, the day began normally for 8-year-old Elizabeth and her mother, Mary. They arrived and parked near a hair salon on Cleveland Avenue. When they left the salon, they headed to their car. Mary immediately noticed a young man, who looked to be about 30, confidently approaching them from the direction of a busy intersection. He looked at them strangely, and Mary instinctively felt uncomfortable under his gaze, but she did not panic since they were in a busy area. This young man did not look particularly dangerous. He stood out because of his thick glasses. Mary assumed he was merely asking for directions or something similar. However, when he approached the car, he took a gun from his belt, placed it next to the hood, and demanded a ride. In horror, Mary was ready to give up the keys to the car that the church had given them if only he would let them go. But the criminal did not want the keys. He forced Mary and her daughter to sit in the front, demanded that she drive north. Mary tried to influence the attacker, calm him down, and persuade him to let them go. She convinced him that if there were any problems, he could turn to the church, which would not abandon its parishioners in trouble. Mary stoically remained calm, trying to soothe the kidnapper and even bribing him. However, all her efforts were in vain. She even turned to the Bible, but the kidnapper was clearly not ready to listen to the Holy Scriptures. He ordered them to be quiet and keep driving. When they stopped at the nearest intersection, a patrolman pulled up next to their car. The kidnapper threatened to kill Elizabeth if they went in the same direction as the policeman or gave him a signal. Mary was forced to change their route, and the kidnapper noticeably relaxed. They drove to a wooded area in Anoka, stopping at a deserted camping site. There, the attacker ordered them out of the car and deeper into the vegetation, cautiously looking around. He forced them into the trunk, tied the mother and daughter together, taped their mouths shut. He then got behind the wheel and drove into the countryside. There, he planned to pick up a spare tire for his van, placing it in a trunk right on top of the captives. At that moment, two neighborhood boys became curious about what was happening and came dangerously close. One stood in front of the car while the other, named Jason Wilkman, approached the trunk from behind. The little boy curiously looked at the wheel and seemed to notice something underneath it. The kidnappers saw Jason and panicked. Without thinking twice, he grabbed Jason and threw him into the trunk with the others. When Jason's friends saw what had happened, he immediately ran home to tell his family. The kidnapper chased after him but was too far behind to catch up. In a panic, he jumped behind the wheel and took off. Jason was crying, and Mary tried to talk to him, but he was too scared, could only tell her his name and age. She tried to calm the children down, and it worked. At least they stopped crying. The trip was short, but Mary heard them moving around in the rough terrain. Branches and bushes constantly hit the vehicle as the criminal drove deep into the forest for several kilometers. Here, he pulled Jason out of the trunk and took him away. A few minutes later, he returned alone, did not open the trunk, but simply got behind the wheel and drove away. Mary prayed that he would just let the innocent child go because she did not hear any shots, but gloomy thoughts crept into her mind. Mary's car was left in the bushes. It was hard to see because he was increasing the distance from the police. The kidnapper got into a black van without windows, along with Mary and her daughter. Before driving off, he double-checked the ropes on his captives, then returned to the city and took them to his electronics store, where he allowed them to use the toilet and gave them juice to drink. They stretched their limbs, which had gone numb. Mary tried to find out what he wanted, but instead of answering, he taped both their mouths shut again, tied them up, put them back in the van, and drove them to his family's house in a neighboring town. The small house was only 10 kilometers from the apartment where the Stauffer lived with their children. Nevertheless, Mary and daughter did not know where they were. They were mistaken while he wandered through many places. The criminal took both of them to the bedroom of the house, which was small, dark, and cramped. He removed the door handle and locked the door. Getting used to the darkness and looking around, Mary and her daughter realized they were in a kind of storage room filled with clothes, toys, but there was nothing that could help them. At the same time, Mary's husband, Irv, and her son, Steve, were waiting for the return of the mother and daughter from the beauty salon. They had a family dinner planned, and the last preparations were to be made before leaving. Both should have returned long ago, which began to worry the household. At 4:30 p.m., Irv called the salon, and the hairdresser confirmed that the visitors had left long ago but had no idea where they were going or what could have happened. Irv called his wife's friends, but they did not know where she might be. Then he turned to other members of the Baptist community and involved them in the search. They all called local hospitals, acquaintances, police stations, and even morgues to find the missing. When no information could be obtained, Irv contacted the police. However, from the very beginning, it was obvious that they suspected of himself of the disappearance of his wife. By that night, the authorities were already engaged in the search for a 6-year-old boy, Jason Wilkman. The search for Mary continued. Irv explained that he was not involved in the disappearance of his wife and daughter. He and his son were waiting for them at home and had no idea what happened after they left the hairdresser. But the authorities did not believe him and suspected he had done something to them. The next morning, a car was found. They even managed to find 2 sets of fingerprints on the steering wheel, but their owners were not in the police database. The car had no license plate, so investigators could not determine whose car it was. The area around the car began to be thoroughly searched. First of all, they found the car's license plate. It had been torn off when the criminal escaped through the bushes. Suspicions arose that Jason's abduction and the disappearance of Mary and her child could be connected. This helped them know that the car belonged to Mary. It seemed that everything was very serious, and the missing persons were in danger. About 300 police officers and volunteers were gathered to begin the search operation. Announcements were published featuring images of the missing. Based on the words of the boy's friend, a composite sketch of the kidnapper was created. From that moment on, the authorities' suspicions regarding Mary's husband only intensified. Ironically, the composite sketch bore a striking resemblance to him. Both he and the kidnapper were dark-haired, wore glasses. Burr became the main suspect in the disappearance of the two children and Mary. However, Burr provided an alibi supported by a photo and passed a lie detector test. His fingerprints did not match those found in the car, yet the authorities still did not want to clear him as a suspect. Burr continued to emphasize his innocence and pointed out that the investigation's misconceptions were leading them away from the real goals of the search operation. Before her first trip to the Philippines, Mary had taught at the school, and among her ninth-grade students was Ming Sun Shiu, a teenager of Taiwanese American descent, with whom Mary had a good relationship. He showed great promise in sports and also had significant academic success. It seemed that the teenager had a great future ahead of him. Later, former students of Mary said that Ming was enamored with his math teacher. He thought she seemed smart and stately. After Mary went to the Philippines, she returned and moved to another city. Ming became truly obsessed with his teacher and constantly remembered her. He began to pursue his secret love, and it looked radical. Confusing the younger of Stauffer with his father, also named Irv, Ming showed up at Mary's in-laws house in Duluth on the 4th of July and held of Sr. at gunpoint. Ming took him into the house and told him to call his wife to the room. When Mary's mother-in-law entered, Ming realized his mistake. Ming claimed he was simply mistaken and threatened that if they went to the police, he would return and shoot them both, and then he ran away. The elderly couple had no idea that Ming was really interested in the younger Irv. They never reported it anywhere and didn't even tell the mayor and his son about the incident until they returned from the Philippines in 1979. No one had any idea who could have attacked the families, neither the motive nor the goals were known. Mary only found out that the attack was carried out by Ming when he had already taken her and her daughter prisoner. He proudly told her about it before attacking her. Mary had no idea that he had been spying on the family from the forest, which was located not far from the house where they settled. Probably, he decided to attack because he saw preparations for departure and understood that soon they could leave again for a long time. Shortly before the kidnapping, Ming even tried to get through the doors of the patio, but nothing came of it. Later, he attempted to get through the storage room and drilled several holes. Burr found sawdust and removed it, but he still did not understand the relevance of their appearance. Now everything fell into place. In the meantime, the captives experienced the hospitality of the criminal. Immediately after the kidnapping, Ming admitted that Mary was lucky that her family was not nearby during the surprise attack, as he was ready to do anything to take her, even kill everyone. The next day after the kidnapping, he pulled Mary out of the closet, spread a blanket on the floor in the living room, tied her up. After that, he made a 3-hour video interview in which he revealed his identity. Mary remembered Ming when he spoke about math lessons at school. He reminded her that he was the student she had failed in exams. Mary immediately recalled who he was but could not understand what he meant. He told her that he couldn't get an academic scholarship because of her, as his parents had died, and he couldn't afford to go to college because of that. After losing his place in school, he was drafted into the Vietnam War, which led him to a prison camp where he experienced some tough times. He blamed Mary for all of this. Now, he wanted to make her pay. There was one flaw in this tragic story: Ming had made it all up. Mary remembered perfectly well that he graduated from high school with excellent marks, so he could easily have received a scholarship to any college. In reality, he attended the University of Minnesota and graduated from there. He never served in the army and instead immediately opened his own store. Mary realized that his story was a lie designed to impose a sense of guilt and manipulate her. In fact, Ming lived in a fictional world. He wrote fantasy stories about many women whom he abused, and after that, they begged him to be with them. Among these fantasies was his 9th-grade math teacher. During a video interview, he revealed his intent not to cause physical pain but to inflict emotional trauma so that she would feel dirty, humiliated, and insulted. The footage included more than 6 hours of assaults. Over the next few days, a friend of Ming returned a borrowed camera but kept the tape of the torture. He abused Mary daily. Ming claimed he was not a pedophile, he never abused Elizabeth, nor did he force her to watch the torture of her mother, although he repeatedly threatened to do so. Unfortunately, this did not mean that Beth would remain on the sidelines of his villainous fantasies. Elizabeth turned out to be a pawn in his fictional stories. Ming demanded that Mary show love, but she refused because she was a believer and a devoted wife who had promised to love only her husband. To force she to submit, he threatened to place her daughter in a thick plastic bag and tie it shut, claiming that it would take 4 to 5 minutes for Beth to inhale all the oxygen, after which she would die. He also threatened to kill all the members of her family one by one until Mary obeyed. Mary was forced to meet him halfway. She kissed him on the cheek, feigning love, but this was not enough. Only a kiss on the lips calmed him down. Then he removed the bag from her daughter's head. Later, during a similar incident, he left Elizabeth in his van for 4 hours. This happened on a hot summer day, and in the scorching sun, the girl miraculously did not die. This experience finally convinced Mary of the need to obey him, otherwise, they would be in trouble. In the meantime, their family continued to hope that they would see both Mary and Elizabeth alive. Weeks went by, and according to statistics, the probability of the missing returning after such a long period was practically zero. After 2 weeks, the police called Irv and reported that they had found a woman's body in the forest, which was presumed to be Mary's. He provided his wife's dental records and was relieved to learn that it was not her, and therefore, there was still hope for the safe return of both his wife and daughter. Meanwhile, life in captivity continued. After some time, Ming softened the strict rules of the internal regulations. He allowed his captive to eat in the kitchen, take a shower on the 10th day, even gave Elizabeth several board games and a TV. He began to affectionately call her Betty. Despite the circumstances, this looked very unpleasant. During this period, Ming forced Mary to write 2 letters to her husband. In the first letter, she was to convince the police that she had not disappeared but had simply run away from her hated husband, whom she no longer loved. In the second letter, he voiced demands that the police stop their interference, or else no one would ever see either of them again. Ming still led a double life. He was involved in business management and worked in his electronics store as if nothing had happened. From the outside, it seemed that he was quite decent and that his life was completely ordinary. In reality, he was a kidnapper and a murderer. After 3 weeks, Ming took a rented mobile home and went with his victims to the fair in Chicago. Before that, they stopped at a shopping center in Madison, Wisconsin, to change clothes, as they had been wearing their old clothes since the abduction. Both victims were under close watch from him. He would not allow them to escape. He kept one of the 2 by his side, and in case of escape, he promised to kill the other. This was how he was able to grant them some relative freedom of movement, albeit within reasonable limits. Despite all of Mary's efforts to warn the police by using a receipt from her bag while shopping, the bank was notified and, unfortunately, the FBI never received the information. It apparently got lost. When Elizabeth was left unattended for a while in a shopping mall, she attempted to tell a group of teenagers that something had been stolen, but they just laughed and walked away, not believing her story. By the end of this little trip, all 3 even stopped by the University of Minnesota campus to watch fireworks. During this time, at least 3 police cars drove past them. However, Mary knew that the criminal had a gun with him, and she feared that he might harm them without thinking twice if she called for help. So she remained silent, despite her hopes. On July 7, 1980, Mary and Elizabeth faced serious difficulties. Ming realized that he could not remain in his house forever without being noticed. Therefore, he decided to buy a mobile home for the 3 of them, making it clear that he intended to continue this madness and wanted to eliminate any possibility of being caught. Mary understood that there might not be any other chances to escape, so she planned to wait for him to leave for work before trying to free herself. The next morning, Ming went to work as usual, and Mary began her fight for freedom. She managed to muster enough strength to remove the heavy door from its hinges, from which the captive's shackles were attached. Until that moment, they had been unable to do this. Suddenly, she heard some noise and feared that Ming had returned. Mary was instantly frightened. She acted quickly and returned everything to its original state, as if they were still tied up. They seemed to sit and listen forever until finally, they calmed down, realizing that Ming was gone. The nervous tension played a cruel joke on them, but the situation did not improve because precious time had been lost. Mary had no idea when their tormentor would return. She got to the phone and called the county sheriff's office. She was put on hold twice before finally contacting the detective who was leading the search for the 3 missing people. Thanks to a tag from a dry cleaner, she provided the address where she and her daughter live. Mary was most shocked by the policeman's question about whether Jason was with them. It was then that she realized that the child had never returned home and was probably killed in that forest during a stop. In fear of Ming's return, they simply hid in the storage room, afraid that their tormentor would soon come back. Fortunately, the police arrived before long, and the mother and daughter were freed. Both victims were photographed, having remained shackled with bicycle cables for almost 2 months. FBI agents went to Ming's shop, searches were conducted, and the criminal was arrested without resistance. A few days later, Mary went north to visit her family. Her happy release from captivity, along with her daughter, became a real sensation. However, in reality, their misadventures were not over yet. Just a few days after being incarcerated, Ming hired a killer. It turned out to be a cellmate, Richard Green, who was about to be released from prison. He asked Green to commit the murder of Mary and Elizabeth so that they could not testify against him. Additionally, Green was supposed to help Ming escape from prison in exchange for a promise of $50,000 once the job was done. As an advance, he handed over a check for $1,000. Fortunately, this plot failed, and the criminal was caught. Richard did not admit that he was hired. This was only discovered during a second interrogation and after checking the financial transactions. The prosecutor's office had more than enough evidence to build a strong case. The jury ultimately viewed a 3-hour interview that fully revealed Ming's insidious plan. The hearing was a tense moment for all involved. The mayor had to walk between the prosecution and defense tables. As soon as she asked Mary the first question, Ming jumped up and attacked the mayor. However, the prosecutor blocked his path. The guards knocked him down and immobilized him. The hearing lasted 10 days, after which Ming was found guilty of kidnapping. Difficulties arose even before the hearing began. He confessed to one of the psychiatrists who worked with him that he knew where the body of Jason Wilkman. He was then offered a plea bargain. The authorities agreed to reduce the charge to second-degree murder. In late October, Ming led the police to the boy's body. Jason had died from blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted from behind. Ultimately, Ming Sen Shiu was sentenced to life in prison but retained the possibility of parole after 30 years. Mary then had to testify again as a material witness in the trial for Jason's murder. It seemed that this terrible story was about to end. However, this time Ming was prepared for the meeting. He secretly brought a knife into the courtroom. During cross-examination, when Mary was answering questions, he jumped up from his chair, grabbed her by the neck from behind, and took her hostage, holding the blade near her throat. Fortunately, there was a policeman behind who managed to snatch the knife away and prevent the murder. As a result, Mary suffered a cut that went through her chin and the corner of her mouth, requiring 62 stitches. The second trial was postponed. As part of a plea bargain, Ming confessed to the kidnapping and second-degree murder of Jason, after which he was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with the terms of the sentences to be served concurrently. The case of this dangerous criminal was again in the spotlight. In 2010, the judge ruled that, in the case of parole, Ming Sen would be sent to undergo a state program for individuals who have committed violent abuse crimes. According to the judge, Ming met the criteria for criminals who require life imprisonment. After many hours of evaluating psychiatric reports, it was decided that he posed a permanent threat to society. For Mary, this decision came as a great relief, as Ming had openly declared to Beth, and then the entire family, that if he were ever released, he would come for them. Curiously, Ming's business was estimated by experts to be worth about $250,000. The Stauffer family filed a civil suit against him as compensation for illegal restriction of freedom and emotional distress. However, upon hearing about this, Mary declared that the right to seek justice belonged only to the Lord God, and she refused to pursue the case. After all these events, Mary repeatedly stated that despite all the evil this man caused, she continues to pray for him. Ming Sen Shiu is currently being held at the medium-security federal prison in Marion, Illinois. The ordeal of Mary Stauffer and her daughter Elizabeth stands as a chilling testament to the depths of obsession and the fragility of ordinary life. Yet, through nearly 2 months of unimaginable torment, Mary's unwavering faith and courage not only secured their escape but also illuminated a path of resilience for her family. The tragic death of Jason Wilkman and the scars left on the Stauffers underscore the devastating ripple effects of one individual's malice. Decades later, with Ming confined and deemed a perpetual danger, Mary's choice to forgive and pray for her captor reflects a profound strength that transcends vengeance. Her story endures as both a sobering warning of unchecked obsession and an inspiring reminder that even in the face of profound evil, hope, faith, and the human spirit can prevail. Let's head over to the small, quiet town of Malang in North Cotabato, Philippines. It's a place known for its calm vibe and rural charm, where life moves at a slower pace. The people here are deeply connected to the land, relying on agriculture for their livelihood. In this peaceful town lived the Magwad family. Unlike many others, they led a pretty stable life. Cruz Magwad, the father, was an elementary school teacher who was well respected and loved by everyone, often being praised for his hard work. His wife, Lovella, was the principal at the same school. Together, while they didn't make a lot of money, they were considered one of the more privileged families in town. Their youngest child, Criziel Lewis, was 16 years old. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer even at such a young age and was determined to work hard to achieve that goal. Besides being intelligent, he was also creative, playing guitar, drawing, and reading in his spare time. His older sister, Criziel Gwyn, was the more intense one, super smart, driven, and goal-oriented. She had always been that way as a kid, being a Girl Scout with a sash covered in so many badges that there was no room for more. Gwyn didn't stop there. She enrolled in a pre-med program during high school and planned to become a doctor. By all accounts, Gwyn was the type of person who would sit with you at a party if you were feeling shy, sticking by your side until you felt at ease. That's how she met 17-year-old Janice Seabiel. However, unlike Gwyn and Lewis, Janice's childhood was far from happy. She wasn't privileged enough to attend school and had to work from a very young age. Even worse, she grew up without parents. Her first real memories began around the age of 8. Before that, everything was a blur. She only recalls being found by a stranger wandering alone on a huge shipping container boat. Her parents were nowhere to be found, and Janice believed they had abandoned her. A stranger was kind enough to post her picture and name online in an attempt to find her parents. They shared her story on Facebook and various online forums, but no one ever came forward. Eventually, Janice was dropped off at the Philippine version of Child Protective Services, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, where she moved from one foster home to another. Not long after, Janice was offered a live-in nanny job by a family. Though she hated the job, she was incredibly grateful for the opportunity. Janice shared all of this with Gwyn, and Gwyn was so deeply moved by her story that an idea began to form in her mind, an idea that could give Janice the safe, loving home she deserved: adoption. Together with Lewis, Gwyn decided to present this idea to their parents. Like a well-thought-out thesis, they approached the subject with serious dedication, explaining that adopting Janice wouldn't just change her life, it would help their family too. They convinced their parents that Janice could pitch in with the chores around the house, which was a significant consideration in their Asian family culture. It wasn't uncommon for children to share the responsibility of washing dishes, cleaning, and cooking. With one more set of hands to help, the family would run more smoothly. Gwyn's parents weren't exactly rolling in money, but they believed in teaching responsibility. The kids had chores, had to keep their grades up, and attended church every Sunday. They were strict, but it was out of love. Gwyn and Lewis respected that. In 2021, Janice moved in, and it was like she was instantly part of the family. The Magwad welcomed her with open arms. Louis even gave up his own room so Janice could have a more comfortable one. They enrolled her in school right away, and for the first time, Janice didn't have to wake up with the constant worry of finding food or going to work. She was finally allowed to be a kid. As Janice settled into her new life, the bond between the three siblings grew stronger by the day. We could see the happiness shining through, especially in the videos they posted on TikTok. Janice even got to experience a family vacation for the first time, something she had always dreamed of. Laughter filled the air as they explored new places together, creating memories she would cherish forever. For once, Janice felt like she belonged to something bigger, something safe and full of love. But just when everything seemed perfect, Janice's world was about to shatter. On December 10th of that same year, she posted a series of statuses on Facebook claiming that she and her siblings were under attack. It was just days before Christmas, a time that should have been filled with joy. Instead, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. At that time, Mr. Cruz, their father, was at school doing some chores related to the upcoming holiday, while Lovella, their mother, was away on a work trip. Everything changed when Mr. Cruz received a phone call that left him frozen in terror. The voice on the other end told him that their home was being ransacked, and his children were inside. By 3:15 in the afternoon, Cruz finally arrived at the house. It was eerily silent outside the front door. His eyes locked onto a blood-soaked blanket on the ground with a knife nearby. He called out for his kids, but there was no response. He moved quickly to the back door and managed to find a way inside. Cruz moved rapidly through the house, his voice echoing off the walls as he searched for his children. When he entered the living room, that a horrifying sight met his eyes. There, lying on the floor, was his daughter Gwen. A towel soaked in blood was wrapped around her body, her limbs and torso were covered in multiple slash wounds. But it was the injuries on her neck that were particularly severe. Crime scene photos later revealed the gruesome extent of the wounds. Her flesh was torn apart, and ants had already begun to gather on her body. Not far from Gwen, near the main door, Cruz found Louis. His hands and feet were bound, and a gag covered his mouth. His body was riddled with fresh stab wounds, and the amount of blood suggested that the attack had happened just moments before Cruz arrived. But there was one more person missing. Janice's heart pounded as Cruz continued to search the house, calling her name. Finally, Janice appeared. She emerged from her room, her hair wet and her face pale and shaken. She was in shock, barely able to speak. Seeing her, Cruz immediately called the police. The officers arrived soon after, stepping into a crime scene that would later be described as one of the most gruesome in the Philippines. Blood pooled on the floor, and the house bore the marks of extreme violence. Janice, while trembling, told the officers that they had been attacked. The house was in disarray, cabinets had been pried open and personal belongings were scattered across the rooms. At first glance, it seemed like a robbery. However, investigators knew that appearances could be deceiving. They needed to confirm whether anything valuable had been taken to solidify the robbery theory. At the same time, as part of their protocol, the police did not rule out the parents as persons of interest. The police needed to confirm their alibis and whereabouts during the attack. The investigators turned their attention to the room where Janice said she was hiding during the attack. It was messy, but that wasn't unusual for a robbery scene. What stood out, though, were the details that didn't add up. The disarray in the room, though chaotic, didn't have the usual signs of a real robbery. So the police began to search the house more carefully, and they soon found some crucial evidence just outside the front door. The police discovered a blood-stained shirt, which they believed had been dropped by the attacker while trying to escape. About 100 meters away, they found a plastic bag in a ditch. Inside were bloody pants and underwear. It seemed the attacker had deliberately discarded these items to hide evidence. Inside the house, the scene became increasingly horrifying. The living room floor was littered with shards of glass and broken bottles, a clear sign of the violence that had unfolded there. Expansive pools of blood reveal the brutal nature of the attack. Among the carnage, investigators discovered a discarded knife, a baseball bat, and a hammer, each stained with blood. These weapons were assumed to have been used in the murders. Crime scene analysts took careful note of the blood patterns, which provided key insights into the sequence of events. They determined that Gwen, the older sibling, had likely been killed first. Her blood had partially coagulated and rigor mortis had already begun to set in. In contrast, Lewis's blood appeared much fresher, suggesting he had been murdered after Gwen. The different states of the blood and bodies made this theory even more plausible. Lewis's hands and feet were bound, while Gwen's were not. This discrepancy indicated that Gwen might have been ambushed and killed quickly, while Lewis was restrained, likely to prevent him from resisting before his own murder. The fact that so many different tools were used and that the victims had distinctive types of wounds strongly suggested the involvement of more than one attacker. This theory was supported by the fact that Lewis had been restrained. It would have been difficult for a single person to control a victim while also carrying out such a brutal attack. Adding to the mystery, crews confirmed that the weapons found at the scene were his. The murderers seemed to have used tools that were readily available in the house, which made the crime even more unsettling. As investigators continued to gather evidence, they found something that stood out. The family's laundry machine had been used, but there were no freshly washed clothes anywhere in the house. This odd discovery suggested that something unusual had happened after the crime, perhaps an attempt to erase evidence or cover their tracks. The extreme brutality of the crime prompted local authorities to launch a manhunt for the suspects. The public was shocked, and the need for justice became urgent. To help with the investigation, the vice of the Municipal Council of Mlang, North Cotabato announced a reward of 200,000 pesos for any information leading to the capture of the perpetrators. The mayor also offered an additional 50,000 pesos as a bounty. These actions emphasized the gravity of the case and the community's desperate need for answers. Autopsies were performed on Gwen and Lewis over 2 days, starting on December 13, 2021, and the results were chilling. Gwen had sustained 32 stab and slash wounds, some of which were deep enough to almost sever her limbs. One of her ears had been cut off, and her neck and upper arm were nearly severed. Her body also showed signs of blunt force trauma, likely caused by the hammer and baseball bat found at the scene. Additionally, the backs of her hands were bruised, covered in defensive wounds, indicating that she had fought fiercely. Meanwhile, Lewis had endured 51 knife wounds, some so deep that they exposed his bones and internal organs. Red marks on his neck suggested he may have been strangled. Unlike his sister, Lewis had no defensive wounds. He also had signs of blunt force trauma on his limbs and torso. All these injuries were consistent with the weapons recovered at the scene. Investigators quickly ruled out the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. Though the rooms appeared ransacked, only Gwen's phone was missing. Nothing else of value had been taken, leading authorities to believe that the killer or killers were familiar with the victims. It was also striking that the crime took place in broad daylight, which made the entire situation even more unsettling. Before the autopsy results were made public, rumors began circulating online accusing Janice of being involved in the crime. These rumors gained traction due to her survival, the weapons being from the family home, and the locked front door. The accusations grew increasingly intense, with some even threatening Janice. Under the mounting pressure, the police decided to question her. Janice described the events of that day. She had been studying with Gwen in her bedroom while Lewis was downstairs in the living room. Suddenly, they heard screams, and 3 men broke into the house. The 2 girls rushed downstairs and saw the 3 men attacking Lewis with the weapons found at the scene. The attackers then turned on Gwen. In fear, Janice fled upstairs, locked herself in her bedroom, and hid under the bed. Janice was too scared to call the police, so instead, she texted the family group chat asking for help. Later, she messaged her adoptive mom saying, "Mom, help." When no one saw those messages, Janice went a step further and posted on social media, saying, "Help. Somebody has broken into the house. I don't want to die. I'm hiding in my room. Help." After a few minutes, she deleted the post, worried the attackers might see it and come after her. By the time someone saw the post and reached out to her mom, Janice was too scared to pick up. She even changed her social media username and put her phone on silent, clearly trying to hide. When the house finally fell silent, Janice emerged from her hiding place, too afraid to go downstairs. She claimed she took a shower and changed clothes to calm herself, finishing just as Cruz arrived home. However, there was something odd about this part of the story. Janice had told the police she locked herself in her bedroom the moment the attack began, so why did her room look like it had been ransacked? That raised serious questions. More importantly, Janice's version of events was directly at odds with the forensic evidence. The autopsy results and the way the injuries were distributed made it clear that Gwyn was the first victim, not Lewis. This major discrepancy between Janice's account and the evidence made investigators even more suspicious. Something wasn't adding up, and they started to take a closer look at Janice's statements. At first, she told the police her phone was off during the attack, but Cruz remembered calling her phone and hearing it ring with no answer. When Janice was confronted with this, she changed her story again, now claiming that she had been in the shower and hadn't heard her phone ringing. This was starting to sound suspicious. But that wasn't the only thing that raised eyebrows. Cruz also revealed some information about the murder weapons that added fuel to the fire. The baseball bat used in the attack originally belonged to Lewis. He had kept it in his room on the top bunk as a kind of protection. However, after being adopted by Cruz, Janice had taken over the top bunk. The hammer used in the attack was another tool that Cruz kept around for home repairs. He was very careful about where he stored it, usually hiding it behind the washing machine. Cruz mentioned that only 3 people knew exactly where that hammer was: himself, Gwyn, and Janice. This meant that the killer or killers had to have known the family's routines and possessions very well, almost as if they had been living in the house with them. Things became even more suspicious when a delivery driver came forward. The driver had arrived at the house just 18 minutes before Cruz was contacted by a neighbor who noticed that no one had answered the door. The driver kept calling out, hoping someone would respond. Eventually, he noticed a woman peering at him through a door before she suddenly walked away. The woman's identity was never confirmed, but it raised serious doubts about where Janice was and what she was doing during the attack. At the crime scene, it had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. This was significant because it meant that whoever had done this was likely someone familiar with the house, someone who had access to a key and could lock the door after the crime. At this point, it was pretty clear that Janice had something to do with the murders. However, since Janice was only 17 years old, still a minor. Under Philippine law, the police couldn't arrest her without solid proof. This legal issue made them tread carefully, as they couldn't move forward with an arrest until they had more definitive evidence. Rather than arresting her immediately, the authorities placed Janice under the care of the Social Welfare Department while they investigated who had actually committed the murders. If Janice's claim about other people being involved was true, the police had a considerable amount of work ahead of them. 5 days after the murders, a significant breakthrough occurred. The police discovered Janice's fingerprints on the murder weapons. This was a huge deal, but it wasn't the smoking gun. After all, Janice had lived in the house where the weapons were stored, so her prints could have been there simply from handling them. Still, it was a lead they couldn't ignore. To ensure she wasn't treated unfairly, Janice was given a lawyer by the Social Welfare Department. However, things took another unexpected turn when Lavella, Janice's adoptive mother, found a contact tracing form while searching Janice's room for clues. To her surprise, it wasn't Janice's form. It belonged to a 17-year-old boy named Esmeraldo Aldo Cano Jr. Aldo was a sacristan at a local church, and Janice had known him from the orphanage. This discovery sent the police scrambling to determine if Aldo had anything to do with the murders. Soon enough, witnesses came forward confirming that Aldo had been near the crime scene on the day of the killings. One woman stated she saw Aldo drop Janice off near the house right before the murders, and another neighbor said she saw him asking for directions to the house that morning. When shown a picture of Aldo, the woman immediately recognized him. Then, on December 16th, 6 days after the murder, Janice, with her lawyer present, gave a full confession. She admitted to being involved in the murders along with Aldo. Janice explained that her motive stemmed from deep resentment and jealousy. She felt that Gwen and Lewis were receiving all the love and attention from their parents. In her mind, they were standing in the way of her getting the affection she had longed for. She even confessed that killing them would leave her as the only child in the family, guaranteeing that she would get all the love and attention she had recently started receiving after being adopted. Janice revealed that her ultimate goal was to take Gwen's place in the family, driven by years of emotional neglect in the orphanage where she had grown up. By December 18th, Janice's confession was officially recorded, although it was inconsistent, much like many of her previous statements. The police tracked down Aldo, who voluntarily surrendered, admitting his role as well. Forensic analysis later confirmed that blood found on discarded clothing in a ditch belonged to Aldo. Like Janice, Aldo was also a minor, so he was placed under the care of the Social Welfare Department. Later that same day, in an unrelated banned substance raid, police arrested a 17-year-old for possession of illegal substances. When they searched his phone, they found something that tied him to the case: Gwen's stolen cell phone. The serial number confirmed it had been taken after the murders. The police pieced it together. Janice had enlisted Aldo to sell the phone because she couldn't get rid of it herself. Unfortunately, the phone had been damaged, making it impossible to retrieve any useful data. The boy who had the phone wasn't involved in the murders, he had simply bought it from Aldo. Because Janice and Aldo were minors, the police couldn't release any juicy details about their confessions to the public, despite the parents pressing for information. As the investigation progressed, Janice stopped cooperating, making it even harder to figure out exactly what had happened. Some people believe Janice's confessions weren't even the full story. Whispers circulated that the murders were even worse than she had let on, like the possibility that Lewis was tied up and forced to watch as his sister was murdered before he was killed as well. After the shocking confessions, Lovella, the siblings' mother, was interviewed and reflected on the warning signs she had missed. According to Lovella, they had adopted Janice 5 months before the murders. At first, everything seemed fine, the family welcomed her, and she appeared grateful. However, soon small red flags began to show. In August 2021, when Gwen's parents were hospitalized, Cruz noticed that 10,000 pesos, about $170, set aside for emergencies was missing. Janice claimed thieves had taken it, but the next day a large sum was found hidden in her school bag. After some questioning, Janice admitted she had taken the money. Despite this breach of trust, the family, particularly Gwen, chose to forgive her. They were sympathetic to her troubled past, attributing the theft to the survival instinct she had developed after years of hardship. Janice apologized, and the family, hoping this was a one-time mistake. They accepted her apology, believing the worst was behind them. However, as months passed, Janice's behavior started to shift in unsettling ways. She became lazy, irresponsible, neglecting household chores and showing a disregard for reminders. She apologized but never followed through. Although troubling, it didn't raise any immediate alarms until the morning of the murders. On that day, Janice did something she had never done before. She called Cruz and Lovella mom and dad for the first time. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a red flag, indicating a deeper, darker shift in her emotional state. It was as if something had clicked in her mind, setting in motion what was about to happen. As the investigation unfolded, more shocking truths came to light. Janice had lied about her origins from the start. Her story of being an orphan was a fabrication. Her parents were alive and had spent years desperately searching for her. When the case went viral, Filipino amateur sleuths dug into her past and uncovered a nearly decade-old missing persons notice. Her parents weren't very active on Facebook back then, so they missed the post. Fast forward to the murders, and that same post started circulating online again. It didn't take long for Janice's biological parents to recognize her. Born in 2005, Janice was the youngest of 3 children, but her childhood was filled with chaos. Her father's gambling addiction tore the family apart, and after remarrying, her mother tried to make the best of the situation by dividing what little they had left among her children. Eventually, Janice and her siblings were placed in different orphanages. By 2020, Janice had actually reunited with her biological family, but that reunion didn't last long. Her relatives later claimed she cut them off, saying they were too poor to be of any use to her. This betrayal shocked everyone. Things took a darker turn when Janice's biological mother, devastated by what her daughter had done, attended the funeral of Gwen and Lewis. In her grief, she kept apologizing, overwhelmed with guilt about her daughter's actions. In one heartbreaking moment, Janice's biological mother even knelt down, but the Magwad weren't seeking revenge. They made it clear that they weren't angry, only seeking justice. They insisted that Janice's biological mother encourage her daughter to confess. Janice's mother tried to visit Janice at the social welfare office, but Janice refused to see her, citing strict rules. Then, the investigation took a jaw-dropping turn when evidence surfaced suggesting the murders were premeditated. Screenshots of a conversation between Janice and an unknown person went viral. In the messages, Janice confessed that she wanted to kill her siblings, thinking their deaths would give her the freedom she craved. She even wondered if anyone would still accept her if she committed murder, expressing a chilling belief that no matter what she did, God would forgive her if she asked. Some sources claim that Janice often talked about the 2009 horror movie The Orphan, a film about a young girl adopted by a family who ultimately betrays and kills them. She even posted on Facebook that she loved the movie and watched it repeatedly. When Janice's trial began, her behavior was just as disturbing. She was seen smiling and laughing in court, showing no remorse or regret. Cruz and Lovella, devastated by the loss of their children, said in interviews that they might have forgiven Janice if she had shown even a hint of genuine remorse, but her coldness only deepened their pain. The case became a national sensation in the Philippines. From March 2022, when Janice and Esmeralda were officially charged with murder, to their conviction on May 17, 2022, the case was closely followed by the public. Janice Sibiel was sentenced to 31 years in prison, while Esmeralda Cano Jr. received a 29-year sentence. However, both sentences came with one condition: they would serve them under the supervision of the Department of Social Welfare and Development until their 21st birthdays, after which they would be transferred to adult prisons. Gwen and Lewis's parents had mixed feelings about the trial's outcome. While they recognized that the courts handed down the toughest punishment possible under the law, they felt the laws were too soft. The biggest issue, however, was Janice's complete lack of remorse. Cruz and Lovella were outspoken against Republic Act 9344, which limits the legal accountability of minors. According to this law, the minimum age for criminal liability is 15, and individuals between the ages of 15 and 18 can be held accountable but are sent to youth centers or rehab programs instead of adult prisons. This law prevents minors like Janice from being tried as adults, even for heinous crimes. Many argued that kids shouldn't be capable of planning or committing such brutal acts. In the US and other countries, minors committing these kinds of crimes would have been tried as adults. Cruz and Lovella felt strongly that Janice's age shouldn't excuse her from taking full responsibility, especially for such a violent and premeditated crime. This view was shared by many who felt the law was too lenient in cases like this. They publicly called for changes to the law, wanting those who commit violent acts at a young age to be held fully accountable. Some of the most heartbreaking facts to come out of the investigation revealed that Gwen almost escaped. She had the chance to run, but when she heard Lewis calling for help, she went back, hoping to save her brother. At around 4 p.m. on Friday, April 15, 2011, in Lorgues, France, 27-year-old Alexander Durand was on his way home when he received a call from his younger sister, Séverine. She was a high school student, and the siblings had a close relationship, often calling each other. However, today she called not to share good news or weekend plans. Instead, she informed him that their mother, Colette, had not picked her up after school as she usually did. The day before, Séverine had been with their father, who had taken her to school in the morning. She had tried calling their mother multiple times, but her calls went unanswered. This was unusual because their mother was normally very responsible, and there was no reason for her not to come and pick up her daughter. Séverine was worried that something might have happened, such as an accident. She advised Alexander to check the situation and visit their mother's house. Alexander was also worried, so he called his mother several times, but received no response. Finally, he decided to visit his mother's house himself. When Alexander arrived, Severine was already there, but she was still very anxious, even more than before. She was in the house with the gendarmes, and what they discovered was very concerning. Colette's car was parked in the driveway, the doors were unlocked, and the keys were in the ignition. 52-year-old Colette had vanished without a trace. The keys to the house were also in the car, so Alexander took them and went inside to see what was happening. The house was completely empty, as if she had simply disappeared. The gendarmes quickly began their search for Colette since the situation was becoming increasingly alarming. Initially, they suspected a robbery, but they found that nothing was stolen from the house. The doors and windows were untouched. In the back seat of the car, they discovered Colette's purse, which held all her identification, bank cards, and cash. She could not have left willingly without those items. Tension heightened. Even after 3 hours of searching, there was still no news. Both the house and the car were thoroughly examined, but no leads emerged. As a result, the search area was expanded to include the outskirts of the town. None of the neighbors had seen anything out of the ordinary, no suspicious noises or activity near Colette's home. To learn more about her, the police interviewed her relatives. Colette, a divorced mother of 4, was known for her reserved and calm demeanor. She was not someone who would spontaneously disappear. She had no mental health issues or addictions. At the time, Colette was working as a supermarket manager. She was polite, punctual, and a devoted mother. Everyone who knew her was confused and did not understand what had happened, as she had no troubling relationships and no history of violence. The evidence suggested that Colette's disappearance was not accidental. The police believed that whoever was involved in this incident was someone she was very familiar with. At the very least, Colette had allowed this person into her house or had given them the right to enter. After investigating, the police identified the primary suspect. She lived by herself in a small 2-story house. To save on expenses, she rented the first floor to a man named Bernard. During his interview, Bernard made some strange and unsettling remarks. He speculated on how Colette might have been abducted, suggesting that she could have been struck on the back of the head, rendering her unable to call for help. He also provided a detailed account of her medical condition, noting that she was diabetic and needed urgent assistance to avoid serious health consequences. His level of knowledge about Colette raised suspicions among the police. Furthermore, Colette's son, Alexander, revealed that Bernard was in love with his mother, which could explain his insight into her behavior and routines. This revelation increased suspicions, as Bernard could potentially have a motive. Alexander noted that, despite Bernard's interest, his mother did not reciprocate and had no intention of developing anything beyond friendship. She was solely focused on her children and her work, completely dismissing the idea of a romantic relationship with Bernard. When detectives investigated Bernard's background, they found that he had a criminal history. In 1999, he assaulted his girlfriend with a weapon after she tried to end their relationship. His ex described him as very hot-tempered and unable to control his rage. As a result of these incidents, suspicions about Bernard increased. Colette's lack of interest may have caused him to become angry, and what happened next remains unclear. In 1999, Bernard received a brief 6-year prison sentence for an attack, mainly because the girl he attacked survived. Now, he was called to the police station for questioning as the primary suspect in Colette's disappearance. The police were trying to determine when Colette went missing, and Bernard claimed to have useful information. He reported that on the afternoon of April 14, 2011, while watching television, he heard noises coming from the second floor, where Colette had lived. He could hear footsteps on the wooden floor, but then everything went quiet. He did not see Colette leave, making it likely that he was the last person to have seen her. However, the police were concerned about Bernard's behavior. He was unable to recall the exact time of the noises or even remember what show he was watching, raising further suspicions. Bernard's main problem was that he didn't have a verifiable alibi. However, there was no evidence against him, so the police had to let him go. The next morning, officers came to inspect his house. Bernard greeted them with shouts and was initially unwilling to let them enter. Eventually, he agreed to show them around the first floor of the rented property but continued to make odd comments. Notably, he pointed out a hatch that led to the basement. He remarked that if he had killed someone, he would have hidden the body there, yet he insisted he was innocent and claimed the basement was empty. Upon inspection, there was indeed no one there. Meanwhile, when law enforcement searched Colette's home, they discovered suspicious stains believed to be washed blood, but this could not be confirmed. Despite the lack of evidence, suspicion remained around Bernard. Deciding to keep a close watch on him, the detectives sought to establish the exact time of Colette's disappearance, but clues were scarce. She had been alone for several days with minimal contact with her neighbor until April 15th. Anything could have happened during that time. Investigators began to piece together her movements, partly based on Bernard's statement that he had heard loud noises from the floor above on April 14th, the day before she vanished. As the investigators looked into the case, they realized that no one had seen Colette since April 15th. They managed to locate her friend, who stated that he had last seen Colette on April 14th around 3:30 p.m. at a gathering with mutual friends. He mentioned that after leaving the party, she got into her car intending to drive to Draguignan but planned to stop at home first. This was the only information available and was considered a starting point for the investigation, as more than 40 hours had passed since she went missing. Communicating with Colette's friend helped them determine a rough timeline for when she went missing. In her car, investigators found not only her personal belongings but also her mobile phone. They began analyzing the phone to see whom Colette had communicated with in the hours leading up to her disappearance. Notably, there was a call that lasted about 40 seconds, made shortly before 3:30 p.m. The call was from Sylviane Fabre, Colette's ex-husband's sister. Sylviane was contacted, and she stated that she had met Colette during Colette's marriage to her brother. At that time, Colette's relationship with her husband was not very good, so they decided to separate. However, afterward, the former spouses and their families managed to maintain friendly relations. Sylviane mentioned that back in 2008, they collaborated with Colette to invest money in a joint business. Shortly before Colette's disappearance, the business partners had a small conflict regarding these assets, but Sylviane claimed that everything was resolved, and they continued to work together. Together, Sylviane and Colette created a real estate company that generated a substantial income, which provided Sylviane with a potential motive. Not only were they distant relatives, but they also had shared finances and property, which can often lead to such conflicts. Naturally, Sylviane denied any wrongdoing. Colette's daughter mentioned that Sylviane often had conflicts regarding their joint activities. They could argue and reconcile several times a day. However, Colette's daughter described all these disputes as minor issues that were resolved quickly. The gendarmes checked Sylviane's schedule for the last few days. She had an alibi confirmed by her son. For almost the entire duration of the investigation, suspicions against Sylviane were not substantiated, and the search operation again hit a dead end. On April 17, 2011, the prosecutor's office began a judicial investigation into the disappearance of Colette. With no leads left and all suspicious individuals cleared as unlikely suspects, there was no option but to notify the media and hope, with their assistance, to obtain new witnesses who might have noticed something. At a recent press conference, officials announced that while there were priority leads in the criminal investigation, no suspects had been identified. This news sparked significant interest among journalists, as the case could potentially involve themes of business, money, love, or betrayal. Consequently, rumors began circulating about Colette immediately, some of which were quite alarming. Her information, background, and photos quickly became prominent in newspapers and on television. Her children expressed their desire to see her again and shared how difficult her absence was for them. The most concerning aspect was that the critical 48-hour window for finding her alive had already passed, significantly diminishing the chances of a successful rescue. While the prosecutor's office hoped to gather new leads from the public through the media, the police were actively searching the nearby villages. Following the press conference, the search area was widened, and a special investigative unit took over the case. Colette's disappearance began to attract national attention. The media frenzy intensified as they attempted to connect her case with another notorious crime that had recently shaken France. A few days before Colette went missing in early April 2011, 5 members of the Dupont de Ligonnès family, including the wife and 4 children, were found murdered under the terrace of their home in Nantes. The head of the family, Xavier, disappeared shortly after the murders, having been spotted on the outskirts of the city on April 15. Authorities believe Xavier was responsible for the crime, and he was placed on a nationwide wanted list. Notably, the location of the massacre was only 30 kilometers from Colette's home. The media quickly linked these incidents together. The timing coincided with Colette's likely disappearance, raising the possibility that Xavier kidnapped her. An even stranger coincidence was that the Dupont de Ligonnès family lived in a house that Colette had sold in 1992. Xavier was viewed as a respectable citizen, a devoted husband, and a caring father who was engaged in his community and known for his honesty and fairness. However, it later emerged that Xavier was deep in debt at the time he murdered his family. Just days before the killings, he purchased cement, tools, and 4 bags of lime, suggesting he had a motive and was preparing for the crime. Journalists speculated that Xavier may have had a grudge against Colette, but the reason for his potential revenge remained unclear. Rumors spread quickly, with theories ranging from a fraudulent real estate deal to unrequited love. Others suspected it could be part of a planned escape. Xavier could have taken Colette so they could be together again. Witnesses came forward, claiming they had seen Xavier's car near her home. Some even reported seeing him stop in town on April 14. Although these accounts seemed unlikely, detectives noticed clear connections between Xavier and Colette. This led them to investigate the possibility that the two had escaped together. Consequently, Colette shifted from being seen as a victim to potentially being viewed as an accomplice in crimes that might have involved Xavier's family. However, friends and family of Colette quickly disputed this theory, asserting that she was not capable of cruelty. As detectives explored new leads that emerged almost daily, they became convinced that there was no romantic or conspiratorial link between Xavier and Colette. They began to feel that the similarities between Xavier and Colette were merely coincidental or tragic coincidences. To definitively eliminate this theory, they decided to examine both Xavier's and Colette's mobile phones. They encountered a challenge. Xavier's phone could not be tracked, and there were no calls or messages from Colette's phone to his. After their investigation, they found no evidence of any contact between the two after the sale of the house. Although the theory regarding Xavier was intriguing, it ultimately consumed valuable police time and resources. 3 weeks after Colette's disappearance, any possible link to Xavier was dismissed. Xavier himself was never found, leaving the French police at an impasse. The case has reached a dead end and will not make any progress until at least May 15, 2011. On this day, about 30 kilometers from Lorgues, 2 tourists were returning from a forest hike and taking photos. While using a remote path to capture some scenic shots, they were hit by a strong, unpleasant smell coming from the side of the path. One of the tourists decided to investigate the source of the odor. As the woman approached a pile of stones, the smell intensified and became unbearable. When she moved one of the stones, she discovered a leg protruding from beneath the rocks. The tourists quickly called the police. Within minutes, gendarmes arrived at the location and found the body of a woman in an advanced state of decomposition, making it difficult to determine her gender. Only her clothing provided a clue. The police attempted to identify the victim but were initially unsuccessful. They took photographs of her clothes, accessories, and jewelry, which were then shown to the families of various women who had gone missing in the area. Among those families were the children of Colette. Her daughter and son recognized their mother based on what she was wearing. Although the gendarmes believed they had identified Colette a month after her disappearance, they chose to wait for more conclusive evidence. DNA analysis was necessary to confirm family ties, as appearance alone could not provide definitive proof. Ultimately, the examination verified the police's suspicions. The body was indeed identified as Colette Durand. On May 17, 2011, an autopsy was conducted on the body that had been found at the Forensic Medical Institute. Unfortunately, the condition of the remains was so poor that the exact cause of death could not be determined. The forensic expert did confirm that Colette had not been abused before her death, but it did not help the police make much progress in the case. As a result, the investigation into her disappearance shifted focus to a murder investigation. On June 9, 2011, Colette's body was buried. Law enforcement officers attended the funeral, knowing that criminals sometimes show up at such events to witness the impact of their actions. Some may seek to relive their emotions, while others might derive satisfaction from seeing the grief of the victim's family. Several officers remained in vehicles, while others blended in with the attendees, discreetly observing the proceedings. During this time, the police noted that Sylvian, Colette's business partner and sister-in-law, was missing from the funeral. Although Sylvian and Colette were close, Sylvian's absence raised suspicions. This concern increased a few days later when Sylvian attempted to end her life. Although she survived with minor injuries and poisoning, her actions were alarming. When the police arrived after a call from Sylvian's neighbor, they found Sylvian lying on her couch at home. She was unable to fully express herself, so she was taken to a medical center for assistance. However, the officers did not leave empty-handed. They discovered a lengthy letter addressed to her son, David Perel, which was several pages long. While the letter did not contain explicit confessions regarding her actions concerning Colette, the detectives interpreted it as a potential admission of guilt prior to her death. The police decided to speak with David, and he provided new insights into the troubled relationship between Sylvian and Colette. He believed that shortly before Colette's death, she and Sylvian had experienced a serious conflict related to their shared business. Intrigued, the detectives asked David to recount his activities on April 14th. He described the daytime as uneventful, but his account of the evening was much more compelling. On April 14th, at around 10 p.m., Sylvian asked David to drive her to Colette's house to discuss some important business matters. Her own car was broken, so she turned to him for help. However, on their way, his car also broke down a few kilometers from home. Despite the rain, they decided to walk back instead. He took the car battery with them, and together they returned in an attempt to fix the car. On the night Colette disappeared, this mother and son spent hours in the rain attempting to repair a car left outside the city. The gendarmes suspected that David was trying to create a questionable alibi to explain his absence from home. This suspicion was further fueled by Sylvian's initial statement to the detectives, in which she claimed she had spent the previous days at home. It seemed implausible that she could forget such a significant event. When Sylvian regained consciousness in the medical center, her account of the events changed. Her new story mirrored what her son had previously told, including all the important details. The gendarmes decided to investigate her claims. They found that on the night of April 14th to 15th, there was no rain in the area. Additionally, it was odd that Sylvian and her son were unable to flag down a passing car for a ride home. Why did they walk so far while carrying a battery with them? The road's vehicle monitoring system revealed that approximately 5 cars passed by during the time they were walking home. It seemed unlikely that none of these drivers would have stopped to assist them in the rain. This raised suspicions that David and Sylvian were hiding something and might be involved in the death of Colette. Unfortunately, there was no physical evidence to support these suspicions. As a result, the decision was made to keep a close watch on them over the next few months. Their phone calls were monitored, and on February 8, 2012, this surveillance yielded important information. The police intercepted a conversation between Sylvian and Bernard, who was Colette's neighbor. It became clear that Bernard knew much more than he had initially revealed. On April 14th, he not only heard sounds coming from above but also saw Sylvian's car arrive at the house, indicating he was aware of her actions. David, Sylvian's son, was also involved, as he was driving for his mother. On February 20th, 2012, David and Sylvian were arrested. Detectives viewed David as the weak link. During questioning, he quickly confessed, seeming relieved to unburden himself of his guilt. He revealed that on April 14th, They arrived at Colette's home around 3:30 p.m. Afterward, Sylvian lured her into a barn behind the house. A business dispute led to further conflict, during which Sylvian attacked Colette, beating her to the ground. Then, she took a rope from the barn and began to strangle Colette in front of David. Although he did not intervene or participate in the attack, he admitted to helping move the body afterward. They left Colette's body on the property, covering it with a tarpaulin. In the evening, when they fabricated the story about the broken car, they took the body out of town. David assisted Sylvian in dragging the deceased away from the road and covering her with stones. Despite David's confession, Sylvian denied any wrongdoing. She claimed the death was accidental and that they hid the body out of fear of the police. However, it was puzzling how well prepared she seemed for the crime, as she had latex gloves that prevented her from leaving fingerprints. After being detained for 48 hours, Sylvian was charged with murder, while David was released. Though he was viewed as an accomplice, his testimony needed verification, so he remained under judicial supervision. The next step was to determine the motive. It turned out that the motive was linked to financial issues. Sylvian's business was on the brink of failure when Colette uncovered that Sylvian was embezzling money from clients. Another possible motive was jealousy, as Colette was thriving while Sylvian's problems continued to grow. Shortly before the tragedy, Sylvian had gone through a painful divorce, and one of her 2 sons had been convicted of violence. Communication between her and David had nearly ceased, and his involvement in the crime marked the end of their close relationship. On January 21, 2014, David was charged in court with the murder of Colette. He claimed that he was only an accomplice and that he helped hide the body due to pressure from his mother. Sylvian, his mother, argued that the incident was an act of involuntary manslaughter. She explained that she had lost her temper after a conflict with her business partner, Colette, who was trying to take everything from her. Facing life in prison, Sylvian sought to downplay her guilt. The prosecutor's office looked into the role of the tenant, Bernard. Although he witnessed the conflict between Sylvian and Colette, he did not report it because he feared Sylvian. Ultimately, he testified as a witness for the prosecution. On January 23, 2014, the jury found Sylvian Fabre guilty of manslaughter, sentencing her to 30 years in prison. Bernard was acquitted, and David Perel received a 3-year suspended sentence. Over the years, Colette's children struggled to understand what had happened in that barn with their mother. Despite the complicated trial, they felt uncertain that the entire truth had been uncovered. They were unhappy with the court's verdict, believing that Sylvian had committed premeditated murder but had received a lenient sentence. Additionally, they felt Bernard was more involved than he had admitted and had evaded responsibility for the crime. The case of Colette Durand is a tragic and mysterious story that leaves many unanswered questions for her family and the community. Colette, a devoted mother, suddenly disappeared, leading to a lengthy investigation filled with suspicions of love, money, and betrayal. Ultimately, the truth was revealed through David's confession and Sylvian's sentencing, but was justice truly served? Bernard, the neighbor with a murky past, remains a significant question mark as he evades all charges. For Colette's children, the pain lies not only in losing their mother but also in the feeling that the secrets surrounding their mother's death may be buried forever. Angel Ormston was born in 1975 in Mentor-on-the-Lake, a quiet suburb of Ohio, USA. This area has about 7,000 residents, and everyone knows each other. Children from local families often get along and grow up together. Life here is very simple and similar. The local high school serves as the main place of learning for most young people in town. Angel is a friendly and cheerful girl. She particularly enjoys walking around the area with her friends and often drives around with loud music. Local teenagers often gathered at a large shopping mall in a nearby, bigger city, which featured restaurants, a movie theater, and various stores. It made sense that Angel would find a part-time job there. In the summer of 1992, she started working at a fast food restaurant as she prepared for her senior year of high school. This job not only allowed her to earn some pocket money but also helped her save up for college. Her daily routine was consistent. She worked in the mornings and spent time with friends afterward. On the evening of July 31st, 1992, 17-year-old Angel planned to go to her restaurant to pick up her paycheck and do some shopping. She promised her mother, Jackie, she would be home before the mall closed. Initially, her mother was not concerned and went to bed, assuming she was out with friends. The next morning, she woke up to find Angel missing from her room. Despite this, she didn't worry too much because it was common for her daughter to stay over at friends' houses, especially on weekends and holidays, so she pushed her uneasy thoughts aside. In this close-knit community, crime was rare, and young people often visited each other without worry. However, Angel, a high school student, didn't always keep her mother informed, which led to concerns. Her mother didn't want to restrict Angel too much, allowing her daughter considerable freedom that matched her independent spirit. Angel's upbringing was relaxed, her mother was adaptable and aimed to maintain a harmonious environment. Meanwhile, her father was often away as a long-distance truck driver. Despite the lack of strict rules or curfews in the Angel household, unsettling thoughts began to creep into Jackie's mind. Angel was missing all Saturday, and when her mother woke up on Sunday to find she still hadn't returned home, worries began to set in. She called families where Angel could stay, and her brother also went to the shopping center where she worked. Upon arriving at the parking lot, Angel's brother noticed her Honda Civic, which heightened his concern. He hoped to find Angel inside but instead found her purse, comb, and other personal items left on the driver's seat, indicating she might have vanished. He checked the burger joint where she worked but learned she hadn't shown up for a couple of days. Alarmed, he contacted Jackie, their mother, who hurried to the shopping center to retrieve Angel's car and uncover the truth while pushing aside her fears. Initially, she hoped it was just a series of coincidences. Angel often went out at night with her best friend, Stacy. That day, Stacy's family could not be reached, which gave Jackie some peace of mind. Nonetheless, anxiety grew as Jackie drove around the mall looking for Angel, but she found no trace of her daughter. Friends who did manage to contact her hadn't seen Angel since Friday. By 8 p.m., Jackie still couldn't reach Angel, deepening her worry. Jackie finally decided to report her daughter Angel as missing by going to the police. Although Angel was last seen on July 31st, Jackie did not visit the station until August 2nd. This delay raised suspicions among the police, but Jackie explained that she believed she needed to wait 48 hours before reporting someone missing. Jackie provided detailed information about Angel, including her life and relationships. Jackie asserted that, up until the very last moment, she was not worried that anything serious had happened to Angel. On the morning of Monday, August 2nd, Jackie managed to reach Stacy, who confirmed Jackie's fears. Stacy had spent the entire weekend at her sister's house and hadn't seen Angel. She was shocked to learn that her friend had been missing for over 2 days. Stacy tried to contact some mutual friends, but none had seen Angel. Following this, Jackie provided the police with new information, prompting them to initiate an active search for Angel. The police first examined Angel's car, which showed no signs of a struggle. The car was in normal condition, with no blood, signs of theft, or forced entry. The officers believed Angel may have left the car willingly. Given her age, they suggested she could have run away, but Jackie rejected this idea, citing their good relationship. Angel was not involved with banned substances and had always remained calm during her teenage years. Despite her independent nature, she was not the type to run away. In fact, she had been making future plans, including furthering her education at university. Detectives worked extensively to investigate Angel's disappearance. They suspected she might have been kidnapped from the car and collected many fingerprints at the scene. Although there were numerous prints, all belonged to family and close friends. Despite this, every individual had to be investigated to clear them as suspects since there were no other leads. The investigation began with Angel's father, a truck driver, but he was quickly ruled out because he had a verified alibi. He was in another state when his daughter went missing. Next, detectives looked into Angel's mother, Jackie. Her refusal to take a polygraph test raised significant suspicion and drew the attention of the investigators. They noted her delay in contacting the police and her decision to take Angel's car from the parking lot soon after learning about the disappearance, which further fueled suspicions. The police lacked the authority to compel her to take a polygraph test, and there was no direct evidence against her. As a result, the investigation continued with Jackie being the primary suspect. Jackie claimed that on the evening when Angel left home, she intended to go to a burger place. However, interviews with local staff revealed that Angel never arrived to pick up her paycheck that day. Investigators seized the opportunity to gather more information from Angel's colleagues. They quickly eliminated Jackie from the list of suspects due to Angel's good relationship with her family. However, they developed several other theories, including a suspicious connection to a former manager known for inappropriate behavior toward female employees. Investigators suspected that the former manager had been spying on female staff while they changed into their work uniforms. Later, he was fired for a harassment incident. Several female employees reported that this manager had touched them inappropriately. When the police investigated him, they discovered he had a criminal record for inappropriate behavior with minors, making him the main suspect. Other women also mentioned that he frequently focused on Angel, often looking for chances to be alone with her in the kitchen and making inappropriate comments. When this was discovered, the detectives were so focused on the case that they overlooked Jackie. The former manager was quickly located and interviewed, but he denied any involvement in Angel's disappearance. He said that she hasn't seen him since they worked together. He claimed that, on the day she went missing, he was far from his hometown and provided a timesheet showing that he was at another location of the fast food chain that day. Despite this evidence, detectives did not exclude him as a suspect and continued to question everyone at the restaurant, including both staff and management. Through their investigation, they uncovered a secret that Angel had kept from her family. She had been fired for consistently being late. While she was indeed heading to the restaurant to collect her final paycheck, this revelation did not provide any new leads regarding her disappearance. Gradually, all of Angel's co-workers were ruled out as suspects because they had alibis. Neither Angel's former manager nor her mother was considered a viable suspect in the case, making it difficult for the police to conduct their investigation. Communication with Angel's closest friends did not reveal any new information. Everyone was shocked at the idea that someone in her circle might wish her harm. She was gentle, trusting, and usually avoided conflict. However, her trusting nature made her vulnerable to someone who might manipulate her into a dangerous situation. After a long period without contact, fears grew that Angel had died. She hadn't reached out to anyone, appeared in public, or used any payment methods. Given these circumstances, the police decided to re-examine the people closest to her, as those responsible for such crimes are often found among acquaintances. The focus shifted to her best friend, Stacy. Although they had spoken to her briefly before, this time the interview lasted over 4 hours. From the start, Stacy expressed a strong willingness to help but firmly denied any involvement. She was cleared as a suspect when she provided a confirmed alibi. She had spent the entire weekend at her sister's house and they had been together the whole time, cooking side by side. The police are trying to ask Stacy if she knows about Angel's relationship with a man. Stacy revealed that Angel had recently become interested in a young man named Mark Sotka, a 19-year-old who had just graduated with honors from their high school. Stacy explained that Angel had been in love with Mark for a long time and even hoped to start a serious relationship with him. However, Angel was very private, especially about her relationships, and only Stacy knew about Mark, not even sharing it with her mother. During the questioning, Stacy reveals that Angel was aware of her pregnancy shortly before she disappeared. They had talked several times about the possibility of telling Mark about the baby, and Angel was optimistic that he would accept her and the child, viewing it as the start of their life together. Stacy was doubtful, but Angel was convinced she could build a family with Mark. The detectives decided to investigate Mark's background before confronting him. It appeared that Mark was not ready for fatherhood. Just before Angel went missing, he started college, which suggests he may have only considered Angel a short fling while planning to focus on his studies. They found no incriminating evidence against him, as he had a clean record and a solid reputation in school. Eventually, Mark was called to the police station for questioning. He was surprised to learn that he was considered a suspect in Angel's disappearance. He denied any involvement and refuted Stacy's claims about their relationship. When he learned that Angel might be pregnant, he laughed it off, dismissing it as a fabrication by his girlfriend. He admitted to having had a brief encounter with Angel at the beginning of summer but said they had not met again since then. Additionally, he had been in a relationship with another girl for 2 years. To support his claims, he needed to provide proof and a reliable alibi. Mark testified that he left work at 5 p.m. on July 31, 1992 to go to a shopping mall. He intended to buy a gift for his girlfriend and then meet friends at a pizzeria. The police began to investigate his account closely. His employment at a car dealership was verified through his timesheet, which matched his claimed working hours. Additionally, they found a receipt for the gift purchase. Several friends from work supported his story, confirming he was at the pizzeria until around 9 p.m. The only inconsistency was that some staff members at the places he visited that evening did not remember him. However, Mark willingly took a polygraph test, which showed no evidence of his involvement in any crime. As a result, he was cleared as a suspect. The investigation hit another dead end, prompting detectives to revisit earlier theories of escape or kidnapping. Discovering that Angel might have been pregnant reinforced these theories. Her family may have opposed her having a child at just 17, leading her to potentially run away to start a new life with the baby. Unfortunately, these possibilities did not bring them any closer to finding her. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Angel's mother decided to take action. She reached out to the community through local media in hopes of gathering information. Her appeal successfully raised awareness about Angel's disappearance, turning the incident into a well-known topic of discussion. Friends and concerned individuals joined in, distributing thousands of leaflets. Charities became involved, and a fund was established, raising $10,000 as a reward for anyone who could provide useful information for the investigation. In the following weeks, the police department received numerous requests for information, which opened several new leads for the investigation. Detectives conducted thorough checks, but these efforts did not yield any significant results. Frustrated, Angel's family made the decision to hire a private detective. When Angel's father returned from a trip, he was hopeful that it would help locate his daughter, unlike the ineffective efforts of the police. However, despite the detectives' hard work, no new information emerged. 3 months passed, and there were still no updates on Angel's case. By this time, her friends had almost lost hope, but her mother remained determined. Angel's mother, Jackie, even altered the message on their answering machine, leaving a note for her daughter in the hopes that she would eventually call. She refused to believe that anything bad had happened to Angel. Meanwhile, the entire city was critical of the police for their lack of progress, which led to increased pressure on law enforcement to revisit existing leads and suspects. Eventually, detectives began to focus on a man who was engaged to Angel's best friend. He was very interested in finding out what happened to her and was vocal in his criticism of the investigation. His name was Candle. Even though he showed a strong interest in Angel, he did not give any information to the detectives or the media. It was believed that he had attempted to start a relationship with Angel and was rejected, which might have led to her kidnapping or murder. On the day she went missing, he was working at a shoe store in the shopping mall where she was last seen. He had a confirmed alibi for that time, but after work, he could have committed a crime, especially since he was nearby. He allowed investigators to search his car, but nothing suspicious was found. The investigation had reached another dead end. On December 15, 1992, 4.5 months after Angel's disappearance, a local resident was out hunting with his dog. While walking through the forest, the dog became uneasy and led its owner away. This took them to a drainage ditch, where the hunter noticed something wrapped in a sheet and tied with a rope. Upon closer inspection, he saw a human hand protruding from the package. The man quickly contacted the police. When law enforcement arrived, they discovered a body in an advanced state of decomposition. Identification was possible only through dental records, which confirmed that it was 17-year-old Angel Ormston, who had been reported missing. On December 16, Angel's family was informed of her death. An autopsy showed she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, which might not have been fatal. However, she had sustained 2 stab wounds to the chest, both delivered with significant force, impacting her heart. As a result, she bled out quickly and died. Investigating her death was complicated by decomposition, but fibers resembling those from a blue carpet were found at the scene. The police compiled a list of all homes associated with Angel, including those of neighbors, family, and friends, in search of a home that might have green carpeting. One key location of interest was the house belonging to Mark, who might have been the father of Angel's unborn child. At the time of the murder, the house was empty as it was for sale. Witnesses claimed they saw Mark enter the house with a girl who matched Angel's description. Although the house had been sold by then, the new owners allowed detectives to inspect it. Most rooms had been renovated, except for the basement. Upon entering the basement, the police found a blue carpet that matched the fibers collected from the scene. Additionally, a clothesline similar to the one used by the killer to move the body was discovered in the laundry room, matching the one found on Angel. The new owners reported that both the carpet and the clothesline had been left behind by the previous owners. These items were sent for forensic analysis, and tests confirmed that the microscopic fibers and the rope matched those used in the crime. Furthermore, a bloody fingerprint was discovered in the basement. 5 months after Angel disappeared, on December 31, 1992, 19-year-old Mark Sotka was arrested on suspicion of murder. During his arrest, he insisted that the police had no evidence against him and claimed he was not the person they were looking for. He immediately refused to cooperate with detectives, prompting forensic experts to conduct a detailed examination of his car. They discovered that although he had attempted to clean the interior, a few small drops of blood remained. During questioning, Mark eventually broke down due to the overwhelming evidence against him. He admitted to committing an act he described as stupid. When pressed for more details, he confessed to murdering Angel. Mark explains that he invited Angel to his house for intimate relations again, but things changed that night when she revealed that she was pregnant and that he was the father. This news triggered a violent outburst from him. He demanded that she get an abortion, but she refused. An argument ensued, during which Angel threatened to cause problems. In a fit of rage, Mark struck her several times in the face. Angel fell in the garage, and Mark, grabbing a knife, returned to the basement and stabbed her twice in the chest. Afterward, he calmly met with his friends at a pizzeria, chatting and laughing as if nothing had happened. Later that evening, he wrapped her body in a sheet, secured it with a clothesline, and transported it in the trunk of his car to a wooded area, where he left it in a ditch. Afterward, Mark returned home, covered up the evidence of the crime, and cleaned his car. After 5 months of investigation, he was arrested as the killer. During questioning, Mark confessed to first-degree murder and led authorities to the location where he disposed of the knife used in the crime. Despite thorough searches, the knife was never found. However, he had limited chances of proving his innocence. The motive for the attack stemmed from Angel's pregnancy, which disrupted his future plans. Mark had no intention of continuing his relationship with her and wanted to focus on someone else. In February 1993, to avoid the death penalty that was in place at the time, Mark officially admitted his guilt. Consequently, he was sentenced to life in prison but became eligible for parole after 30 years. Angel's family pointed out that Mark showed no remorse or compassion, which explained how he was able to deceive the polygraph test. Following his sentencing, he was taken to jail. After serving 20 years, Mark utilized an old Ohio law that allowed him to request a parole hearing after 2/3 of his minimum sentence. His family was informed, and Angel's relatives increased their efforts to prevent him from being released. Their efforts were successful, and he was denied parole in July 2023. After serving 30 years, Mark appeared before the parole board again, but this time, Angel's family opposed his release once again. As a result, he remains in prison. Angel's family expressed their relief to the media, calling it a significant victory for them. Her mother stated that their family would continue to fight to keep the killer incarcerated and would never forgive Mark, who has never expressed remorse or sought forgiveness for taking Angel's life and the life of her baby. The Jacobson family seemed to have it all: wealth, success, and a beautiful home in Wellington, Florida. They appeared to be the ideal loving family. However, appearances can be misleading. Behind the facade of their perfect life lay a much darker reality. What was meant to be a joyful birthday celebration for their two young boys turned into a devastating event, leading to a tragedy so profound that the entire nation would remember their names. To fully grasp this story, we need to go back to 1989 when Neil Jacobson met Frankie at a gym in Bayside, Queens, New York, where they both lived and worked. They are ambitious and successful in their careers. Frankie was making her mark at Lehman Brothers, a leading firm in finance, while Neil had established his own boutique firm on Long Island. They were young, driven, and aspiring to achieve the American dream. Those who knew them praised their relationship as one filled with deep admiration and affection. Frankie was entirely devoted to Neil. In turn, he was seen as a charismatic and kind man with immense potential. Within his family and social circles, he was often regarded as a golden boy, intelligent, charming, and seemingly unstoppable. Together, Neil and Frankie appeared to be the perfect couple. They soon took the next step in their relationship by getting married and moving into Neil's home in New Jersey. Transitioning into married life was easy for them. Together, they created a comfortable, rewarding life filled with shared interests and adventures. They did everything, enjoying activities like biking, scuba diving, and weekend trips to the countryside, which helped strengthen their bond. To an outside observer, their life seemed perfect. However, amidst their seemingly ideal marriage, they felt something was missing: children. They desperately wanted to start a family, but the path to parenthood was challenging. For years, they endured the painful reality of infertility, going through multiple fertility treatments that brought both hope and disappointment. Despite the emotional toll, they remained determined. Finally, in 2003, after many struggles, their dreams came true when they welcomed twin boys, Joshua and Eric. With their lives already comfortable, Frankie and Neil experienced happiness beyond what they had ever imagined. Their family felt complete, and they thrived both personally and professionally. Neil's parents, Harold and Goldie Jacobson, moved from New Jersey to Florida in 2000. Although they loved their new home, they missed being close to their son and his family. They often expressed their frustration about the distance and wished for more time with their grandchildren. In 2005, Harold was diagnosed with cancer, and his health deteriorated rapidly, making it impossible for him to travel to New Jersey. This situation was a turning point for Neil. Being far from his father during such a critical time was too much to bear. He decided to move his family to Florida to be closer to his parents. Before the move, Neil had already started investing in real estate in Florida. He bought a pre-construction condo in Lantana and then a second one shortly after. Real estate quickly became an obsession for him, leading to the purchase of a third condo. Despite recognizing that he was stretching himself financially, he was drawn in by the booming market. Frankie, however, was concerned about his investments and questioned their practicality. Nonetheless, Neil was resolute in his decision and was not willing to change his plans. With his properties piling up in Florida, Neil began pushing Frankie to relocate. She was resistant, hesitant to leave behind the life they had built in New Jersey. She loved their home, their community, and the stability they had created. But as time passed, the financial strain of maintaining their New Jersey home became overwhelming. Eventually, Frankie reluctantly agreed to the move. The Jacobsons officially settled in Florida, eager to start a new chapter close to family. However, things did not go as planned. Neil had hoped to sell their New Jersey home before the move, but the market wasn't in his favor. Just 2 months after they arrived in Florida, tragedy struck. Harold Jacobson passed away. The loss of his father devastated Neil in ways he hadn't expected. He had uprooted his entire life to be closer to Harold, only to lose him so soon after arriving. The grief weighed heavily on him, and his mother, Goldie, later revealed that Neil had struggled with his mental health from a young age. She recalled that as a teenager, he had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, an issue that had plagued him for years. Doctors had noted that Neil had an overwhelming desire to be the perfect child, a pressure that followed him into adulthood. As the years passed, his struggles with anxiety only grew, and soon, things took an even darker turn. The Great Recession hit Florida hard, and Neil, who worked as a mortgage broker. The real estate market collapsed, and the once thriving business that had allowed him to invest so freely was now crumbling beneath him. The financial security he had worked so hard to build was slipping away. As the weight of his losses grew heavier, so did the cracks in his once stable world. The Florida condos he had invested in before relocating were quickly turning into a financial nightmare. Burdened with subprime mortgages, their payments increased month after month, stretching his resources thin. At first, Neil had convinced himself that things would turn around. He had always been a problem solver, always finding ways to make things work. But this time, no amount of determination could keep the walls from closing in. With little to no work coming in, and 4 separate mortgages draining their finances. At first, Neil and Frankie tried to hold on, dipping into their savings to stay afloat. But as time passed, their financial situation only worsened. Bills piled up, debt collectors began calling, and the stress of trying to keep everything together was pushing Neil to his limits. Desperate for a solution, he started making risky financial decisions, one bad choice after another, each one digging them deeper into a hole. He chased after risky investments, sought out loans, all in a futile attempt to stop the inevitable collapse. Eventually, the weight of it all became too much to bear. The financial juggling act had run its course. Frankie was exhausted and drained, made the painful decision to stop paying the mortgages on their 3 Florida condos. It was a move that felt like surrender, but they had no choice. There was simply no more money left to give. By the year 2008, the pressure of Neil's business failures had begun to take a serious toll on his health. At first, it started with minor complaints, aches and pains that he couldn't quite explain, but as time went on, his symptoms worsened. He became sluggish, struggling to muster the energy for even the most basic tasks. His body felt heavy, and his mind clouded. He experienced random bouts of dizziness that left him feeling unstable, and he found himself unable to focus the way he used to. Concerned, he visited the family doctor, who ordered a blood test. In October, the results were troubling. Neil had elevated hormone levels, but there was no immediate explanation for his decline. As the weeks passed, his condition only worsened. The once energetic and determined man was now lethargic, withdrawn, barely functioning. He was eventually diagnosed with depression and transient peripheral vertigo, a condition that further contributed to his constant dizziness. In an attempt to help him cope, his doctor prescribed Zoloft, a common antidepressant. Neil, desperate to feel better, took the medication as prescribed, hoping it would offer some relief. But instead of improving, his mental state deteriorated further. A few days after starting Zoloft, he was called back to the doctor's office, where they added a prescription for Xanax. It was meant to ease his anxiety, but his family and friends quickly noticed that something wasn't right. Instead of stabilizing his mood, the medication seemed to send him spiraling even further into darkness. His paranoia intensified, his emotions became more erratic, and Neil they had once known began to fade before their eyes. Neil's sister, Deborah, became deeply concerned about her brother's rapid decline. She confided in their mother, worried about what he was going through. According to Deborah, Neil had started experiencing terrifying hallucinations. He had grown increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone or something was out to get him. Frankie, his wife, was just as alarmed. She desperate for support as Neil's behavior became more and more disturbing. He had completely withdrawn from the world, he refused to go outside, stopped engaging with friends and family, and even neglected his own hygiene. There were days when he wouldn't even shower, lost in a haze of fear and depression. His paranoia took a terrifying turn when he became obsessed with the idea that the FBI was watching him. He was convinced that federal agents were surveilling him, gathering evidence to have him arrested. He would talk about it constantly, warning anyone who would listen that they were building a case against him. His delusions became more elaborate. He was certain that his phone was tapped, that his home was under surveillance, and that at any moment, the authorities would storm in, take him away. His mother saw the full extent of his paranoia. One of the last times she visited him, Neil pulled her aside, his voice shaking with fear. He told her he was in big trouble, insisting that the FBI was coming for him, that he had done something terrible, though he couldn't seem to explain exactly what. The fear in his eyes was real, raw, and overwhelming. As Neil's mind unraveled, January 23, 2010. The darkness he had been wrestling with for months finally took over, and what happened next would shock everyone who had ever known him. That morning, Neil stood before his wardrobe, fumbling with the top shelf, his hands shaking as he retrieved a loaded gun. His wife, Frankie, still groggy from sleep, watched in confusion, not yet realizing the horror that was unfolding before her. Neil, with the gun in hand, stepped out of the wardrobe, his face hardening into something almost unrecognizable. Frankie's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. In an instant, panic took over. She leapt toward him, struggling desperately to wrest the weapon from his grasp. They tumbled to the floor, the fight becoming a chaotic blur of screams, desperation, and tears. In the midst of the struggle, Neil, in a violent frenzy, struck Frankie, knocking out her front tooth and slicing her finger. Despite the brutality of it all, Frankie didn't give up. She fought with all her strength, but Neil was too much, overpowering her in his disturbed state. With cold detachment, he stood, reloaded the gun, and turned the weapon on her. 2 shots rang out one after another, each striking her in the face, silencing her forever. But Neil's twisted path didn't end there, covered in Frankie's blood. He reloaded the gun and made his way to his son Eric's room. Eric, who had been lying on his stomach in peaceful sleep, was the next victim in the nightmare that Neil had somehow constructed in his mind. 2 bullets tore through Eric's body, but against all odds, the boy survived the first 2 shots. However, Neil was undeterred, his mind fixated on finishing what he had started. He grabbed a pillow and pressed it over Eric's face, ensuring his son wouldn't survive. 2 more shots, and Eric was gone. The house was eerily still now as Neil moved toward the next room, where his youngest son Joshua was sleeping. Joshua, blissfully unaware of the carnage around him, lay curled in his sheets. Neil's actions were methodical, almost as if he were following a script. He covered his son's face with a pillow, silencing him with 2 shots to the face. In a matter of moments, the vibrant lives of his family had been extinguished, with the blood of his wife and children staining his hands. Neil walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower. He stood under the water, numb, as if washing away the sins he could no longer escape. When the shower ended, he dressed, swallowed a cocktail of Vicodin and Xanax, in a haze, left his home. As he drove, the pills began to take effect, making him groggy and disoriented. Less than a mile from his mother's house, Neil passed out behind the wheel, swerving off the road and coming to a stop in the grass. Neil had initially planned to kill his mother, next before taking his own life. But in his twisted state, something inside him held him back. He later told the police that when he was at home, standing in a living room, he thought about going to heaven to be with his father, but he couldn't leave his mother alone, so he planned to take her with him. Thankfully, he never made it to her house. When the police found him, Neil was disoriented, barely conscious, and gripping the gun beside him. As they approached, he muttered, "I killed my family," in a dazed and broken voice. The investigation raised many questions. Was Neil a victim of the side effects of his medications, or had he planned this horrific act all along? A suicide note found later suggested that Neil may have been preparing for this moment, leaving many to wonder whether he was driven by his medications or if he had, at some point, simply snapped. His attorney's defense centered around his mental state. They argued that he had been suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia, all of which had been worsened by the medications he was taking. They described Neil overwhelmed by financial ruin, haunted by the fear that the FBI was watching him, and convinced that there was no way out. His legal team insisted that he had not acted out of hatred or rage but had instead been driven to an unimaginable breaking point due to the side effects of his prescription drugs. To support their argument, the defense brought in medical experts who testified about the dangers of Zoloft and Xanax, the two medications Neil had been prescribed before the murders. These drugs, they explained, could cause extreme mood swings, hallucinations, and suicidal tendencies, especially when taken together in high doses. Neil's behavior before the killings, his paranoia, delusions, and refusal to leave the house, was presented as clear evidence that he had lost his grip on reality. His lawyers pushed the narrative that Neil had been a loving father and husband, a man who had never shown any signs of violence before, making it hard to believe that he had killed his family intentionally. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They painted Neil not as a victim of medication but as a desperate man who had methodically planned the murders. They argued that his financial troubles had reached a boiling point, and that instead of facing them, he had chosen to take his family's lives in an act of ultimate control. They pointed to the way he had executed the killings, retrieving his gun, reloading it multiple times, and ensuring that no one survived. To them, this was not the act of a man lost in a haze of confusion but one who had made a deliberate and calculated decision. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Neil was the suicide note found in his home. The note indicated that he had thought through his actions and accepted what he was about to do. It wasn't the frantic scribblings of someone in the middle of a psychotic episode, it was organized, reflective in the prosecution's view, proof of premeditation. If he had truly been unaware of his actions, why would he have left behind such a message? The prosecution also called witnesses to testify about Neil's behavior leading up to the murders. His sister, Deborah, had noticed a dramatic shift in his personality. He had become increasingly paranoid. His wife, Frankie, had confided in Deborah that Neil was no longer the man she had married. He had stopped showering, refused to leave the house, and seemed trapped in his own mind. While the defense used these accounts to argue that Neil was suffering from a mental breakdown, the prosecution used them to show that there had been warning signs, signs that should have led Neil to seek professional help instead of resorting to murder. Neil's mother, Goldie, also played a heartbreaking role in the trial. She had been one of the last people to see him before the tragedy. She recalled how Neil had told her, "Mom, I love you, no matter what happens." The courtroom fell silent. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, it was clear he had been preparing for what he was about to do. Goldie, who had always seen her son as a kind and loving man. She struggled to reconcile the Neil she knew with the one on trial for murder. As the trial progressed, the jury was left to decide whether Neil Jacobson had truly been in a state of antidepressants-induced psychosis or if he had coldly and deliberately murdered his wife and children. The prosecution emphasized that Neil had made a series of conscious choices, loading his gun, aiming at his loved ones, and pulling the trigger multiple times. They argued that no matter what struggles he was facing, nothing justified what he had done. The defense, on the other hand, urged the jury to consider his mental state, to see him as a broken man who had been consumed by fear, paranoia, and desperation. After days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge, while acknowledging the tragedy of the situation, made it clear that no level of financial distress or mental illness excused the murder of innocent children and a devoted wife. Neil Jacobson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and the courtroom was filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. Neil Jacobson reached a plea deal with the state. He changed his plea from not guilty to guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He stated that the reason was the family's mounting financial situation. Now, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Neil Jacobson answered to the judge in the Palm Beach County courtroom, admitting that he shot his wife, Frankie, and then shot their twin 7-year-old sons while they were asleep in their Wellington home back. During the family's turn to speak in court, Neil held his head down and never looked up. Even after the trial ended, many questions remained. Could this tragedy have been prevented if Neil had received different treatment? Were the medications to blame, or was he simply a man who refused to face his failures? No one could say for certain what had driven him to this point. However, what was undeniable was that a mother and 2 young boys had lost their lives in the most horrific way possible. Nothing could ever undo that. It was here in 1985 that Captain Gary Eastburn lived with his wife Catherine and their 3 daughters, about 10 minutes from the base where he served. Shortly before the events in question, Captain Gary received a promotion, which required him to undergo training at officer school. Consequently, he had to leave his family for a while, attending officer school in Montgomery, Alabama, for about 10 weeks. This was an important step, as the family was planning to move to England, where Gary could serve in the Royal Air Force. Gary had a strong marriage that lasted for 10 years, and they kept in touch while separated. However, on Saturday, May 11, 1985, Gary tried to call his wife several times, but to no avail. He took advantage of several breaks to call but never received an answer. Finally, he reached out to one of his friends who remained on Fort Bragg and asked him to check on his wife. The man did so, but when he knocked on the door, no one answered. He couldn't wait forever, so he simply left Catherine a note, asking her to call her husband back as soon as she could. While shining a flashlight and walking around the house, the friend accidentally woke up a neighbor named Bob Seafelt. When Gary called Bob, he mentioned that he had no idea what was going on with Catherine, but everything seemed strange. After a fitful night's sleep, Bob woke up the next day, with troubling thoughts swirling in his mind. He noticed that a stack of newspapers had piled up near the neighbor's door and realized he had last seen Catherine leave for the store on Thursday. Bob went to the neighbor's door and knocked, but no one answered. Listening closely, it seemed to Bob that he could hear a child crying inside. Knowing the family well, he assumed it was the youngest daughter, who was about 2 years old at the time. Concerned about the situation, Bob called the police at 12:53 p.m. and asked them to check on the family. When the patrolman arrived at the scene, they began the standard procedure and shone his flashlight through the windows. They saw the baby in a crib, appearing pale and emaciated. Despite the protocol the officer needed to follow, they instinctively felt that something alarming had occurred. A patrolman immediately cut through the window screen and entered the house. Upon entering, he saw the baby girl, who was alive but in dire condition. Later, authorities reported that a few more hours in that house could have been fatal for her. After handing the baby over to his partner, the patrolman returned inside the house, checking the rooms with his weapon drawn. In the main bedroom, he discovered the lifeless body of 3-year-old Erin Eastburn. A pillow covered the child's face, and it was apparent that her throat had been cut, with her head nearly severed from her body. She lay on the floor next to her parents' bed, where Catherine also lay. A pillow covered Catherine's face as well. When the officer removed it, he saw that her throat was cut, she was naked and had suffered multiple stab wounds, indicating she had been abused. The scene was horrifying, with blood everywhere. The patrolman ran outside, trying to catch his breath. When he was reminded that the family had 3 children, they still needed to find one more child who might be alive and in danger. He returned to the house, found Kara, but there were no signs of life. The 5-year-old had died in the same manner as her mother and sister. When the investigation began, detectives quickly noticed that a similar crime had occurred 15 years earlier involving a military family, the MacDonald family, who were killed in a similar fashion. This crime was committed by a military man, a husband and father named Jeffrey. Numerous coincidences were found in the handwriting of the criminals and the circumstances of these 2 murders, suggesting that they could have been committed by the same person. However, at the time of the massacre of the Eastburn family, Jeffrey MacDonald was already behind bars and could not have been involved in this crime. Rumors spread quickly, leading many to believe that Jeffrey MacDonald could have had an accomplice or an imitator. Forensic experts found blood all over the house, as well as clear traces of cleaning in some places, indicated by X stains of blood. It was obvious that the criminal had tried to clean up but left even more traces. Using luminol, investigators could see that the marks had been erased on the bathroom door handles. Likely, the perpetrator used a towel that had been thrown into the laundry basket. The crime was believed to have been committed between 8 p.m. on May 9 and 3 a.m. on May 10, 1985. As it turns out, the last person to see the family alive was the nanny, Julie. The young girl had been babysitting the youngest daughter for several days before their bodies were found and was automatically placed on the suspect list. Julie mentioned prank calls that Catherine had complained about before she was killed. Some man had been calling several times a day for 3 months, but it didn't particularly bother Catherine. She didn't feel any danger from these calls and never went to the police. Julie remembered another person with whom Catherine had been in contact, a certain Angela who was going to take the dog from the Eastburns, Dixie. Due to plans to move, they decided to give it away because there was no one to leave it with. According to the nanny, Catherine had left an ad in the newspaper, and after that, she received a call from Angela. Julie was curious about what happened next and unexpectedly shifted the focus back to the bloody crime of 15 years ago. She was worried that it could have been committed by a copycat of Jeffrey MacDonald and wanted to know what the police thought about it. The detective had no trouble getting the suspicious nanny to talk. She willingly shared her long friendship with Dr. MacDonald, believing that he was innocent. They had known each other for a long time and even exchanged letters for several years while he was in prison. When she was asked about her interest in the case, she was unable to justify his behavior, and the detective did not pay much attention to her words. When she confirmed her alibi, he simply removed her from the list of suspects. The police continued to work in the Eastburn house even after midnight, despite the late hour. A young man named Patrick Cohn approached them and decided to tell them about what he saw on the night of Friday, May 10, 1985, at about 3:30 a.m. He noticed a tall, fair-skinned man in jeans, a knitted hat, and a black jacket leaving Eastburn House. The man was carrying a garbage bag slung over his shoulder, got into his white Chevrolet Chevette, and drove away. Patrick's statement was taken seriously, and he was brought to the police station to help create a composite sketch. When the portrait was finished, there was a striking resemblance to a serviceman named Timothy Hennis. He was a 27-year-old man who, along with his younger brother and sister, had been adopted by the Hennis family, a couple who took all 3 of their children from an orphanage. They grew up in a fairly well-off family in Minnesota, which provided them with a bright future. Shortly before these tragic events, Tim married Angela in secret before Christmas in 1984. That same year, Tim's brother died in a motorcycle accident, so they opted for a modest celebration instead of a lavish ceremony. A couple of years later, they had a daughter, Christina. Tim admitted that he was familiar with the victim, Catherine, but there was a good reason for it. They decided to get dog for company, leading to the contact with the woman from the ad. Tim denied any involvement in the crime but mentioned a curious coincidence. He had arranged to meet Catherine on Tuesday, May 7th, just 3 days before the crime, to look at Dixie. When Tim first met the police, everyone was amazed because he looked exactly like the composite sketch. The police asked him to sign a waiver of Miranda rights, to which he agreed, provided he could be assured that he was not a suspect, which turned out to be a ruse. Timothy provided fingerprints, hair samples, saliva, and blood. He confirmed that he had indeed met Catherine that Tuesday and had taken her dog, after which they had not seen each other again. Timothy denied any involvement in the crime and provided a detailed account. Witness Patrick was called to identify him, and he pointed to Timothy. Despite Timothy's insistence that he had not been in the area early in the morning of May 10th, suspicions against him grew stronger due to his lack of an alibi. The police did not yet have an arrest warrant, so Timothy was released. However, after 7 hours, he was detained, officially charged with triple first-degree murder and abuse. Naturally, Timothy was not the only suspect. As is often the case, the police first considered the widower Gary Eastburn. When Gary was informed of the events, he remained surprisingly calm and simply asked if at least one family member had survived. When he learned that only the youngest daughter had survived, he broke down in tears. Gary had grown up as an ordinary young man. At the age of 12, his parents divorced, and his relationship with his stepfather did not work out. Despite this, he had a relatively calm childhood. He met Catherine in 1972, approximately 13 years before the tragedy. At that time, he was around 25 years old, having been born in 1947. Their daughter Kara was born in 1980. Gary decided to become a military man to support his growing family. When he finally returned to the city after the tragedy, he wanted to reach his surviving child. Instead, He was immediately taken to the police station for questioning, where they held him until about 2 a.m. Gary provided a reliable alibi. His blood and hair samples were taken before he was released. He was able to see his daughter late at night. She was in serious condition and did not even recognize him. Afterward, he went into their home to see what was missing. Gary had no idea who could have attacked his wife and children. They had no obvious enemies, but he remembered several prank calls that had started a few months before he left for training at officer school. The caller addressed Catherine by her first and last name, but no one paid attention to it at the time. Everyone thought it was just teenagers playing around, so no one raised the alarm. Now, in light of the tragic events, the calls seemed more suspicious. However, they could not be tracked due to a lack of technology at that time. After inspecting the house, the police reported that a metal safe containing important family documents was missing, along with $300 in cash that had been set aside for Christmas and Catherine's wallet with bank cards. This provided valuable clues. The ATM was identified, and it turned out that a transaction was made using Catherine's card. It was used shortly after the murders, including a transaction on May 11th. Detectives found a witness who provided a description of the man who came at night to withdraw cash, and this description exactly matched Timothy Hennis. In addition, she saw a white car belonging to Timothy. At this stage, the whole city already knew about the crime and the main suspect. Other witnesses also came forward. Timothy's neighbor saw him burning something in his backyard the day after the murder, likely getting rid of evidence. A local dry cleaner reported that Timothy had brought them a black jacket right after the crime. According to the description, it resembled the clothing that the witness Patrick had described. Timothy was questioned when his ex-wife said he had come to visit her that fateful night. His landlord mentioned that Timothy had not paid the rent for the house, which had accumulated over $300 in debt, but as soon as the eviction notice was served on May 10th, Timothy paid it off almost immediately. But where did he get the money so quickly? It seemed strange that the same amount disappeared from the home of the murdered family. Indirect evidence against Timothy was accumulating, but there was no irrefutable proof. By Christmas, it was decided to allow the suspect to post bail with the help of his relatives, and he managed to raise the funds. The reason for this leniency was the results of laboratory tests indicating that his biological materials did not match any evidence. Specifically, his blood type did not match. However, this could be attributed to the low accuracy of the testing methods used at that time. The prosecutor's office decided to turn to the only survivor of that bloody night, 2-year-old Jana. After the tragedy, the girl had not been able to come to her senses for a long time, but by February of the following year, she finally spoke. Gary was categorically against involving his daughter in the investigation, fearing that she would suffer further psychological trauma, but under pressure from the police, he ultimately agreed in order to seek justice for the victims. A special psychologist from North Carolina held 5 recorded conversations with Jana. During this time, she experienced several panic attacks and was still unable to recognize Timothy's photo. Based on the results of these sessions, it remained unclear whether there was one perpetrator or multiple criminals. Thus, the prosecutor's office decided to refuse to use Jana's testimony in the case. The trial was set for April 27, 1986. Timothy rejected the plea bargain offered by the prosecution. His lawyer wanted to change the location of the hearing but ultimately decided it would not make much difference. Instead, the defense focused on refuting the numerous circumstantial evidence on which the prosecution's case was based. The lawyer argued that the witness Patrick was lying when he claimed to have seen Timothy, described his appearance and car in such detail, especially since it had happened at night. He questioned how Patrick could have seen all of this in the dark. The lawyer discovered that the witness was going through a difficult time and had been pressured by the police. During numerous meetings with Timothy's lawyer, Patrick admitted that he might have made a mistake during the identification. The more he talked with the defense, the less certain he became about having seen Timothy on the street that night. On the day of the trial, the lawyer tried to get Patrick to admit that he had participated in the identification under pressure from detectives, but he did not. The defense discovered something even more significant. During the investigation, the police had gained access to the Fort Bragg duty log, which showed that Tim was on duty at the time of the crime, but this page mysteriously disappeared during the investigation. The lawyer believed that the detectives had intentionally torn out this page. Now, the defense attorney pressed this fact, interpreting the police's behavior as an attempt to convict an innocent person by destroying evidence of his innocence. Timothy's family was away at the time of the crime. The prosecution proposed a theory that Timothy had taken advantage of his wife's absence to start a romantic relationship with Catherine and visited her home on that fateful evening. However, Catherine rejected his advances, which angered him, leading him to kill her and her 2 children. The discussion then turned to the bank card. It was determined that the payment method had been used at 2:52 a.m. on May 11th when the defendant was on duty. Although this could not be confirmed, there was reasonable doubt that Timothy could have used it. Even though there was still no confirmed alibi for the night of the crime, the lawyers systematically managed to destroy the majority of the prosecution's arguments and raised doubts among the jury in order to convince them of Timothy's innocence. The prosecution presented frightening photographs from the crime scene and autopsies of the victims, about 100 photographs, which were included in a slideshow that lasted more than an hour. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Despite the defense attorney's desperate attempts to convince the jury of the defendant's innocence, on July 4, 1986, Timothy Hennis was found guilty on all counts. The defense attorney believed that the main reason for this verdict was their failure to insist on a change of venue. He felt that his job was not finished since Timothy was sentenced to death, so he focused on saving his client's life. Interestingly, just a few days after starting his sentence, Timothy received a postcard in prison signed by Mr. X. In it, a mysterious stranger claimed responsibility for killing Timothy's family and apologized for Timothy serving time for his crimes. Mr. X admitted that he had left North Carolina and had no intention of returning. Timothy informed his lawyer about the postcard. Later, it was used at the retrial, but at the time of its receipt, the prosecutor dismissed it as a forgery. During this period, Timothy's parents rallied around him. Despite their divorce, they made every effort to save enough money to pay for his defense. The Supreme Court of North Carolina was approached, and the lawyers cited bias, arguing that the jury had been provoked by the photographs. The defense insisted that nearly 100 gruesome images from the massacre were guaranteed to elicit a negative reaction from the jury. Despite the lack of irrefutable evidence against Timothy, it came to light that several detectives who led the case were nearing retirement. The lawyers believed they simply did not want to leave behind an unsolved crime of such magnitude and were seeking a scapegoat, which they considered Timothy Hennis to be. The defense successfully secured a change of venue to Wilmington, a coastal town located 100 kilometers from Fayetteville. The new prosecutor agreed to this change without hesitation, confident in the prosecution's tactics, but the defense was well prepared and closed all loopholes except for one. There was still no reliable confirmation of the defendant's whereabouts on the night of the murder. The defense aimed to discredit the prosecution's main witness, Patrick, in court. During the interval between the first and second trials, Patrick had committed several minor offenses, including driving without a license. When stopped by the authorities, he advised them to contact the district attorney since he was a witness in the Timothy case. The lawyers believed this statement practically indicated that he had received a bribe from the very beginning. More thorough examinations of the collected evidence refuted the case against Timothy. The shoe prints found inside the house were 3 sizes smaller than his. There was blood on a towel in the bathroom, as well as other traces that did not match his profile. The defense presented a black jacket to the judge that was tested for bloodstains. Even the hair found on Catherine's body did not belong to Timothy. In this context, the numerous circumstantial pieces of evidence that the prosecutor's office had used in the first trial appeared less convincing during the retrial. The prosecution attempted to challenge all the defense's arguments with their own versions, but none of this was compelling in light of the thorough preparation from the defense. 2 days later, the jury found Timothy not guilty on all counts. It is noteworthy that during this hearing, only a few photographs from the crime scene were shown, as opposed to the 100 images in a lengthy slideshow during the first trial. 3 years later, Timothy was released from death row. He re-enlisted in military service, served in Saudi Arabia and Somalia, and then returned to the United States. In 1998, Timothy and his family settled in Fort Lewis, Washington. In 2004, he retired from the Army and took a job at a waste processing plant. He also became a Boy Scout leader. Meanwhile, widower Gary followed his plan and moved with his surviving daughter to the UK. In 2009, he served in the Royal Air Force, after which he married a nurse. In 2009, after leaving the Air Force, Gary returned to the US and settled in Washington. Subsequently, legislation was amended to prohibit retrials for individuals already convicted twice of the same crime. Disagreements arose on the basis that during the first trial, Timothy was in military service, thereby placing him under a different jurisdiction. This left the state in limbo, although it did not exclude the possibility that he could be brought to retrial. Despite such situations being rare in the state's judicial practice, they did not return to the case for almost 20 years. It seemed that life was improving, but the case of the triple murder remained unsolved. Finally, in 2006, a detective investigating particularly brutal murders decided to test the DNA materials collected from the body of Catherine. However, the only information the laboratory could provide at that time was that the collected samples belonged to a light-skinned individual. By 2010, the laboratory in North Carolina became embroiled in a significant scandal. It turned out that over the past decade and a half, the state crime lab systematically concealed or manipulated evidence to ensure convictions. This was revealed in at least 230 cases, 10 of which resulted in the wrongful conviction of innocent people sentenced to death. 3 of them even received lethal injections and were deprived of life. The DNA in the Eastburn case was retested, and the examination showed that the materials from the crime scene in the archive matched those of Timothy Hennis. In light of such convincing evidence, his trial was reopened for the 3rd time. Timothy hired the best military lawyer named Frank Spinner to lead his defense team. The lawyer attempted to tarnish the reputation of the victim, Catherine, by alleging that she was promiscuous with Timothy, hinting that that was why his DNA might have turned up in her home. Timothy argued that she was unfaithful to him and that the real killer was an individual named Mr. X, who had written a postcard to him while he was in prison. This attempt had the opposite effect. The prosecutor's office pointed out the obvious lie, as Timothy had previously denied any intimate contact with Catherine. He later claimed that he initially did not disclose the affair due to fear of exposure. Despite a fierce struggle for Timothy's freedom, the chosen tactics now appeared unconvincing. On April 15, 2010, a jury recommended that Hennis be sentenced to death. In addition, he was demoted to Private E1, stripped of all pay and allowances, dishonorably discharged from the United States Army. Hennis was incarcerated at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, where he remains to this day. All his subsequent appeals were rejected. Under U.S. legislation, without the president's approval, they cannot execute him. Therefore, the likelihood that he will be deprived of life is low. The U.S. military has not executed anyone from its ranks since 1961. Interestingly, in 1985, when the murders of the Eastburn family occurred, a 20-year-old woman from Rochester, Minnesota, where Tim had lived for a long time, contacted the police to share her story. Upon hearing about the triple murder in North Carolina, she revealed that at the age of 11, she had been abused by Timothy Hennis. Unfortunately, due to a data error, she was not permitted to testify. Had she been allowed to do so, the outcome of the second trial, when he was acquitted, could have been entirely different, and he would most likely have been found guilty again. Even now, this trial raises more questions than answers. The story of the nanny, who cared for the Eastburn children, also raises many questions. Julie was addicted, and there were witnesses who heard her confess to the crime. Additionally, her unhealthy obsession with Jeffrey McDonald, with whom she even corresponded, raises further doubts. Some supporters of Timothy believe that it was Julie who could have imitated her idol and killed the family with whom she worked.